Picture it. Dawn in Georgian Britain. The city wakes not to the hiss of kettles or the aroma of coffee, but to the comforting, yeasty tang of beer. Church bells toll, horses snort, chimneys smoke, and someone, somewhere, is already belching politely into their morning pint. The day begins not with caffeine, but with courage, liquid, lukewarm and malt-based. The Georgian morning wasn't about alertness, it was about survival. Before the empire got its hands on tea, and before coffeehouses took over the respectable morning routine, people reached for the one thing they trusted: beer. Not the kind you sip while watching a football match, we're talking small beer. A mild, low-alcohol brew meant to be consumed by the bucketful. It was breakfast, hydration, and mood management rolled into one. In short, your alarm clock was a tankard. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. For the average Londoner in the 18th century, beer was as essential as oxygen and just as unavoidable. The streets smelled of it. Wages were often spent on it. And in some workplaces, drinking it was literally part of the job. Bricklayers, dock workers, even seamstresses all began the day with a beer ration that was less about indulgence and more about energy. The irony? Everyone was slightly drunk, and yet society functioned mostly. Factories hummed, ships sailed, and the economy boomed, all on a national buzz that would make modern HR departments weep. Productivity meetings probably began with the clink of mugs. You weren't late if you staggered in, only if you arrived sober enough to notice. But before we imagine everyone face down in their porridge, it's worth noting that most morning beer wasn't especially strong. Small beer was a weak brew, often 1-2% alcohol, made from the second or third mash of malt. Think of it as the Georgian version of flavoured water that happened to keep you slightly giddy. It was safer than water, which was a microbial lottery, and had calories too. In essence, it was liquid bread, and in some cases, actual breakfast. Children drank it, pregnant women drank it, clergymen drank it. You'd have a hard time finding someone who didn't. If you were a Londoner in 1750, you were about 70% beer and 30% social anxiety. Picture your average morning. You wake up in a creaky wooden bed, the air smells faintly of coal and wet straw. You groggily reach for the jug on your nightstand, not water, but beer. You pour it into a pewter cup, gulp, wipe your mouth with your sleeve and mutter something about taxes or gout. Congratulations, you're now a functioning member of Georgian society. Breakfast isn't about scrambled eggs and toast, it's a chunk of bread, a bit of cheese, maybe some cold meat, and, you guessed it, another pint. The beer wasn't just refreshment, it was a social equalizer. It linked the manor to the marketplace, the scholar to the smith. Even in Parliament, ale was a companion to debate. Some bills may have been passed with more enthusiasm than comprehension. This wasn't just a habit, it was infrastructure. Breweries were as vital as bakeries. Cities revolved around their barrels and brewers. Beer fueled workers, powered trade and filled tax coffers. It was cheaper than wine, safer than water, and more comforting than either. If Georgian Britain had a national motto, it would have been, "In hops we trust." But let's be clear, moderation wasn't a widespread virtue. Small beer might have been weak, but the sheer volume people drank added up. By mid-morning, even the most pious citizen had a light buzz and a warm glow of optimism that made empire building seem like a perfectly reasonable idea. The humour of it all is that this wasn't seen as indulgent. A morning beer wasn't reelius, it was respectable. You'd have been considered strange or worse, suspicious, if you didn't have one. The Georgian morning crowd was, by modern standards, an entire nation of functional alcoholics, cheerful, productive, and just drunk enough to find the price of bread funny. There's something charmingly absurd about imagining an entire city waking up like this, half-dressed, half-sober, and entirely committed to barley-based hydration. Even the church bells couldn't drown out the collective sound of a million mugs hitting a million tables. This was the world before caffeine became the fuel of civilization. Coffee and tea were still exotic imports, expensive and slightly suspect. Beer was familiar, homemade and patriotic. If tea was the drink of conversation, beer was the drink of consequence. Tea made you reflective. Beer made you brave enough to marry your cousin and build an empire. So when we talk about Georgian mornings, don't think of quiet breakfasts and polite sips. Think of rowdy laughter, frothy mugs, and the unmistakable hum of a nation that met each sunrise slightly buzzed and entirely unbothered. And thus Britain greeted the dawn not with chirping birds and brisk tea, but with foam, burps, and questionable decision-making. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, at least until reformers, doctors, and tea merchants decided to intervene. But that's for later. For now, picture the Georgian sunrise. Smoke curling from chimneys, carts rattling down cobbled streets, and a brewer somewhere whispering a prayer of thanks that Britain still hadn't discovered espresso. Let's get one thing straight. Georgian Britain wasn't short on water. It had rivers, wells, streams, and more rain than anyone asked for. The problem, most of it, was trying to kill you. Every sip was a gamble, part hydration, part bacterial roulette, and the odds weren't in your favour. In a world before germ theory, clear didn't mean clean. If the water didn't have something living in it, it was probably because it had already eaten the last guy who tried. Imagine a London morning, 760. The River Thames sparkles in the dawn light, beautiful from a distance, catastrophic up close. It's not a river, it's a liquid landfill, dead animals, human waste, factory runoff, and the occasional unfortunate sailor all bob along together in grim harmony. This was the same river people use for drinking, washing, and occasionally dumping their secrets. Waterfront property was not a compliment. Even wells, once a symbol of rustic purity, turned treacherous in cities. You could draw a bucket of what looked like fresh water, unaware that your neighbour's cesspit was leaking politely into the same groundwater. Georgian sanitation wasn't exactly a science, it was more of a suggestion. Privies were shallow, drains were rare, and anything that didn't belong indoors ended up soaking into the soil. London's underworld wasn't mysterious, it was just moist. Rural areas weren't much better. Farm runoff, animal waste, and stagnant ponds all contributed to a delightful cocktail of microbes. The result? Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and cholera that could take out whole families faster than you could say cheers. It wasn't unusual for waterborne disease to sweep through a town every few years, leaving survivors pale, thinner, and understandably suspicious of anything transparent. Enter beer, not as a party drink, but as humanity's unintentional life hack. Brewing involved boiling the water, killing most of the dangerous bacteria that made water deadly. Add hops, barley, and yeast, and suddenly you've got a beverage that not only doesn't kill you, but also tastes pleasantly like self-preservation. The alcohol, mild as it was, added another layer of protection, a disinfectant in every sip. The Georgian public didn't understand why beer was safe, only that the man who drinks water buries the man who brews. In short, beer became Britain's sanitation system in a mug. The irony? People thought beer was safe because it was blessed by God, not boiled by heat. Faith in divine hops was stronger than in basic hygiene. The Thames wasn't always this bad. In medieval times, it had been relatively clean, but the Industrial Revolution was like giving a toddler permanent marker and no supervision. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, and dye factories all dumped waste straight into the river. Every drop of blue cloth you wore probably meant a fish somewhere had died, regretting your fashion choices. By the Georgian era, the Thames was so foul that even contemporary writers complained about its putrid effluvia. One observer described the smell as a perfumed mixture of corruption and commerce. You could practically see disease floating downstream. If anyone dared drink directly from it, you'd start writing their obituary before they finished the cup. The rich had options. They could afford piped water from private companies, who promised clean delivery straight to their homes. Unfortunately, those same companies often drew from the same polluted rivers, just slightly upstream from the filth. Georgian marketing was truly ahead of its time, rebranding sewage as crystal clarity. The upper class did occasionally drink water, but only after filtering it through sand, charcoal, or misplaced optimism. Meanwhile, servants and labourers had no such luxury. Their only filter was the mug itself. For them, the choice was simple: beer or burial. The most ironic part? Brewing was one of the earliest public health intervention, and nobody knew it. The process of boiling the mash killed bacteria long before anyone knew bacteria existed. Yeast fermentation lowered the pH, making it harder for pathogens to survive. The result? A stable, safe, calorie-rich drink that sustained an empire of oblivious survivors. Georgian people didn't have microscopes, but they had instincts, and a strong desire to live long enough to complain about taxes. If you told a Londoner in 1750 that invisible creatures lived in his water, he'd have laughed, bought you a pint and assumed you'd already had too many. Even animals weren't spared the beer logic. Horses were sometimes given watered-down ale to strengthen them for labour. It didn't help much, but it made the humans feel better. In breweries, workers were famously allowed beer breaks to prevent dehydration, a bit like modern offices offering coffee machines, except everyone was slightly cross-eyed by noon. You can see how beer became a civic duty, not a vice. It was the one beverage that didn't betray you. In an age when doctors prescribed mercury and barbers practiced surgery, trusting beer made perfect sense. It might not cure your cough, but at least it wouldn't start one. Still, this dependence came with side effects, not the least of which was a perpetually tipsy populace. Hangovers became national hazards. Water would have cured them, but alas, drinking it was still suicidal. The irony of the Georgian breakfast table was staggering. Beer to live, beer to function, beer to forget the beer you'd already had. Clean water wouldn't arrive until much later, when engineers like Joseph Basil Jett built London's modern sewer system in the Victorian era. Until then, every pint of beer was both a toast to life and a reminder that Britain's rivers had declared war on humanity and were winning. So the next time you take a sip of crisp, clear water, raise an imaginary tankard to the Georgians. They brewed themselves out of extinction, one frothy pint at a time. Their secret to survival wasn't sanitation or science, it was sheer, bubbly desperation. If Georgian Britain had a secret ingredient for world domination, it wasn't discipline, nor destiny, nor even tea. It was beer, specifically small beer. That gentle, ever-present elixir that flowed through every home, workshop and ship like a second bloodstream. Forget the Navy's rum or the aristocrats' port. Britain's real empire was built on a soft, yeasty hum that began at breakfast and ended, well, whenever the next pint ran out. Small beer wasn't your modern craft ale, brewed with passion and a hint of pretentiousness. It was everyday fuel, weak, cloudy, and often barely carbonated, the colour of dirty straw and the consistency of liquid bread. It wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to sustain. Workers guzzled it to keep moving, children sipped it to keep hydrated, and priests drank it to keep preaching. In a society suspicious of water but dependent on labour, small beer was the one thing everyone trusted more than God, and almost as much as gossip. The miracle of small beer lay in its low alcohol content. It wouldn't get you staggering, not immediately anyway, but it kept thirst at bay while delivering calories in a world where breakfast could be a chunk of bread and optimism. It was brewed from the third or fourth run of malted barley, meaning after the strong ale had been drawn off, the same grains were reused to make weaker brews. Think of it as recycling, but with more burping. This humble drink was the working class's life insurance policy. In the dockyards, barrels of small beer were rolled out like breakfast buffets. On farms, it was rationed with the same seriousness as wages. A thirsty worker was a slow worker, and a slow worker didn't build ships, harvest crops, or lay bricks fast enough for a booming empire. Small beer was the quiet hum behind the machinery of British progress, the lubricant of empire, in the most literal sense. Even children weren't exempt. Schools regularly served beer with lunch, thin, sour, but nutritious. Imagine learning your multiplication tables while lightly tipsy. It's no wonder Georgian handwriting looks like it's dancing. Parents didn't question it. They were just glad their children weren't drinking the cholera cocktail known as water. Beer was considered so safe that doctors prescribed it for the weak, the elderly, and anyone suffering from vapours, which was Georgian for, you look like you might faint, better have a pint. At sea, beer was no less essential. Before the Navy discovered grog and lime juice, sailors relied on beer to survive long voyages. Water stored in barrels quickly turned foul, but beer, with its alcohol content and fermentation, stayed stable. A ship's beer supply wasn't just morale, it was survival. When Admiral Nelson's men hoisted the Union Jack over new territories, they did so with tankards that had seen more action than their muskets. Somewhere in a ship's log, between cannon fire and storms, there's probably a note. Rations low, crew irritable, suggest more beer. Small beer was also a domestic glue. Families brewed it at home in copper kettles, often under the supervision of women who measured malt, stirred mash, and watched the ferment with religious devotion. Every home had its own flavour, some sweet, some sour, some distinctly suspicious, but all served the same purpose, keeping the family hydrated without dying. The smell of brewing was as much a part of Georgian domestic life as the crackle of firewood or the scent of smoke from nearby chimneys. A kitchen without a brewing barrel was like a pub without gossip, technically possible but spiritually wrong. Of course, not everyone brewed successfully. Recipes were passed down, altered, and occasionally ruined. Too much yeast, and you got beer that exploded like a vengeful pudding. Too little, and you got something that resembled regret in liquid form. Yet even the failures were consumed, waste not, want not, which might explain why some Georgian mornings began with both cheerfulness and mild confusion. What made small beer remarkable wasn't just that it kept people alive, it kept them going. It bridged the gap between necessity and pleasure, between hunger and hydration. You could drink it with breakfast and still manage a full day of work, assuming you didn't trip over your tools. It made labourers chatty, sailors loyal, and entire factories smell faintly like bread and bad decisions. There's a certain poetry to it, an empire fueled by something so humble. While other nations toasted revolutions with champagne, Britain built railways on beer breath. The very workers who forged the industrial age were powered not by ambition or caffeine, but by a perpetual state of mild inebriation. It's hard to imagine a modern construction site functioning like that, though to be fair, some Friday afternoons come close. And yet, for all its ordinariness, small beer carried immense cultural weight. It wasn't just a drink, it was a rhythm. Brew, pour, drink, work, repeat. The cycle was as dependable as the sunrise. Beer wasn't an escape, it was life, tamed and brewed into a pint. Georgian Britain didn't merely tolerate alcohol, it organised society around it. So when we say beer built empires, it isn't a joke. Every cobblestone laid, every ship launched, every canal dug. Somewhere behind it stood a brewer, a barrel, and a nation of people too hydrated to fall over but too buzzed to stay entirely straight. Small beer didn't just quench thirst, it defined an age. And if you think that's strange, wait until you hear what else Georgians drank when small beer wasn't enough to keep the empire spinning. If you wandered through any Georgian town at sunrise, you'd find a nation that smelled faintly like warm bread, malt, and ambition. Beer wasn't just drunk in Britain, it was birthed in every kitchen, cellar, and courtyard across the land. From rural cottages to city row houses, the steady clatter of kettles and the hiss of fermenting mash was as common as birdsong. The empire might have been built on small beer, but it was brewed by small hands, and most of those hands belonged to women. For centuries, brewing was women's work. Long before industrial breweries and marketing slogans, the household brewster was a pillar of domestic life. A good brewster was worth her weight in barley. She managed ingredients, timed fermentations, and guarded recipes more fiercely than family secrets. In many homes, beer was both sustenance and side income, a product made with the same precision and pride as bread or butter. If a woman could keep her yeast alive and her mash from souring, she was practically a community hero. These women brewed for every occasion: breakfast, weddings, births, funerals, or just a particularly stressful Monday. The act of brewing wasn't glamorous, but it was empowering. It gave women control over an essential resource: liquid safety. When water could kill and beer could nourish, the brewer was the household chemist, the quiet saviour in a linen apron. A bad batch was more than an inconvenience. It was a domestic disaster. Imagine burning dinner, but dinner also happened to be everyone's daily hydration and social glue. The typical home setup was modest: a copper kettle for boiling, wooden tubs for mashing and fermenting, a paddle for stirring, and an unshakable sense of timing. Barley was malted at home or bought from local merchants, and hops, once controversial, were used to flavour and preserve. Yeast came from previous batches, carefully nurtured like a family pet that happened to burp carbon dioxide. The entire process took days, and every stage required intuition. Too much heat and you ruined the malt, too little, and the yeast went on strike. It was brewing as alchemy, half science, half faith, all froth. Community networks of brewsters formed naturally. Women shared yeast strains, swapped tips, and occasionally gossiped about whose beer was too bitter, a phrase that could refer to both hops and husbands. Local markets sold surplus batches, and alehouses were often family-run, with the woman of the house managing the brewing, while her husband managed the customers and the excuses. In a world where money was scarce, beer was currency, drinkable, tradable, and occasionally explosive if stored near the fire. But as Britain industrialised, home brewing began to change. Cities swelled, wages rose, and so did the thirst of the masses. The small domestic kettle couldn't keep up with the demands of a growing workforce. Enter the professional brewer, and with him the slow decline of women's dominance in the craft. Brewing moved from hearth to factory, from skill to scale. Massive vats replaced copper kettles, and the comforting sound of home fermenting gave way to the roar of mechanised production. Industrial breweries like Whitbread, Truman, and Barclay Perkins transformed beer into big business. They had steam power, controlled malting, and distribution networks that spanned the empire. Beer wasn't just a household staple anymore. It was a product, branded and taxed, measured in barrels rather than jugs. And just like that, the women who once ruled the art found themselves edged out by the men in aprons large enough to double as sails. It wasn't that women forgot how to brew, it's that society stopped letting them profit from it. The rise of the public alehouse shifted drinking from the kitchen to the street corner, and brewing from a domestic duty to a commercial enterprise. Laws began to regulate brewing and sale, often requiring capital or guild membership, both things most women lacked access to. What was once an extension of household labour became real business, and like most real business, it was suddenly men's work. Still, the spirit of the brewster never quite disappeared. Many women continued to make small beer at home, keeping traditions alive even as factories expanded. In rural areas, female brewing persisted well into the 19th century, often blending old recipes with new ingredients brought in by trade. Some brewsters added molasses or herbs to enhance flavour. Others experimented with oats or rye when barley was scarce. They adapted, quietly resisting the industrial tide with every bubbling vat. For centuries, brewing had connected women to power, literal, economic, and social. It was an unspoken rebellion wrapped in linen and yeast. Before women could vote, they could ferment. Before they wrote petitions, they wrote recipes. And while history tends to remember the men who owned the breweries, it forgets the women who kept Britain alive long enough to invent them. It's almost poetic. The nation's favourite beverage began in women's kitchens, only to be taken over by men who built fortunes selling it back to them. The irony was rich, and so often was the beer. What had once been a domestic ritual became a national industry, and behind every frothy pint in a London tavern was the ghost of a forgotten brewster, raising an invisible mug in silent protest. So when you picture the Georgian brewer, don't imagine a burly man with a moustache and a ledger. Imagine a woman in a smudged apron, sleeves rolled up, steam on her face, balancing a baby on one hip, while stirring a vat with the other. She didn't need slogans to assert her worth. She had yeast that refused to die. Step inside a Georgian tavern, and you've just walked into the beating heart of Britain. The air is thick with pipe smoke, perfume and philosophy, a cocktail of humanity that smells faintly of roasted mutton and bad ideas. This isn't just where people drank, it's where they lived. Deals were struck, news was born, revolutions whispered, and hangovers scheduled. The tavern wasn't a side note of Georgian life, it was its headquarters. The door creaks open, and a wave of laughter rolls out like warm air from an oven. You step in, boots on sawdust, and the noise swallows you whole. There's the clatter of tankards, the scrape of chairs, the hum of 50 conversations all happening at once. The barmaid weaves between tables like a dancer trained in diplomacy, balancing 3 mugs and 1 argument. In one corner, a merchant loudly explains the price of sugar. In another, a sailor swears he's seen mermaids, and he's got the beer bill to prove it. Above it all, the landlord presides like a monarch, collecting coins and gossip in equal measure. Every class of Georgian society passed through the tavern door at some point. Labourers drank with merchants, and lawyers slummed it with poets. Status mattered less here than in any drawing room. Ale had a marvellous way of flattening hierarchies. After 2 pints, everyone's a philosopher. After 3, everyone's a revolutionary. Taverns were where Britain's rigid social ladder temporarily melted into a sticky puddle of laughter and debate. And debate there was. These rooms were the informal parliaments of the people. In an age before mass newspapers or social media, news spread by word of mouth, and mouths were easiest to loosen after a few drinks. Politics thrived here. Someone always had a rumour about Parliament, a theory about the king, or a relative who swore he'd seen an MP staggering out of a brothel. Ideas were passed from pint to pint, shaped, exaggerated, and finally declared fact by morning. The Enlightenment had coffeehouses. The common folk had taverns, less caffeine, more conviction. But not all taverns were created equal. Some catered to the gentry, offering imported wines, fine ales, and private rooms where wigs and waistcoats mingled. Others were rougher, filled with sailors, apprentices, and pickpockets discussing the price of bread or the scandal of a neighbour's daughter. A London street might have 6 taverns, each with its own mood. Bawdy, political, quiet, dangerous. The signboards alone told stories. The King's Head, the Fox and Grapes, the Crown and Anchor. They hung like emojis for the illiterate, inviting drinkers to choose their preferred brand of chaos. Inside, the decor was rustic but efficient. Wooden tables sticky with history, candles guttering in pewter holders, smoke curling up to beams blackened by centuries of exhaled ambition. Every surface had heard confessions, conspiracies, and the occasional folk song that should have stayed private. Music drifted between the chatter, fiddles, pipes, and the rhythmic thud of a boot keeping time. If someone spilled a drink, it was practically a baptism. Women were part of the scene too, though rarely as customers unless they were serving or scandalous. The barmaids were legends in their own right, witty, sharp, and entirely in control. They could silence a heckler with a single glance or shame a drunk into tipping double. For many men, the local barmaid knew more about them than their priest. If gossip was a currency, she was the national bank. Taverns were also information centres. Before the postal system was reliable, you might leave a message for a friend at the bar. Lost someone? Check the pub. Need a job? Ask the landlord. Looking for a scandal? Just sit down and listen. News of wars, royal marriages and bankruptcies all broke over ale before reaching the newspapers. The tavern was Georgian Britain's newsroom. Only the reporters were drunk and frequently wrong. And yet, amid the noise and nonsense, real history happened here. Political clubs met in back rooms under the guise of gentlemen's societies. Revolutionary pamphlets changed hands under the table. The early radicals, reformers, and writers who shaped modern Britain didn't work from offices. They argued in taverns, their manifestos written on napkins soaked with beer stains and idealism. Many of the century's fiercest ideas about freedom, class and rights were first shouted over the clink of glasses. You could almost say Britain debated its future one pint at a time. There was a strange democracy to the tavern, a shared humanity that transcended rank. A duke and a dock worker might not dine together, but they could both spill beer on the same floorboard. Here, laughter mattered more than lineage. Even the strict Georgian codes of politeness took a holiday once you stepped inside. Slurred speech was forgiven, arguments expected, and by closing time everyone had forgotten who insulted whom, or at least remembered it fondly. And when the night finally died, the patron staggered home through the fog, leaving behind puddles of ale, scraps of conversation, and the faint echo of songs about lost loves and unpaid debts. The tavern would fall quiet, but its walls, swollen with smoke and memory, held everything that mattered about Georgian life, its humour, its hunger, its humanity. So yes, it's fair to say that half of Georgian policy was drafted between burps. The tavern wasn't a side character in history, it was the stage itself, and Britain, pint in hand, was always ready for another act. At dawn in Georgian Britain, the gap between rich and poor wasn't just measured in land, wigs or waistcoats. It was measured in the kind of beer you drank and how politely you pretended to enjoy it. The same sun rose over both manor and mud hut, but the mornings it illuminated could have belonged to different planets. On one side, a silk-clad lord gracefully lifted a frothing tankard, as if auditioning for a portrait. On the other, a labourer in patched breeches downed his pint in 2 gulps, wiped his mouth with his sleeve and got on with not dying. At the grand country estates, breakfast was less a meal and more an event, a calculated performance of wealth disguised as casual routine. Imagine a long oak table stretching across a room lit by the pale morning light. Silver platters groan under roast beef, cold chicken, eggs, cheese and bread, so white it practically glowed. The air smells of smoked gravy and the faint tang of last night's excess. Servants glide silently, refilling tankards and pretending not to judge. Somewhere a gentleman yawns theatrically, reaches for his ale and mutters something about Parliament or pheasants. Beer was part of this ritual, but not in the same way it was for commoners. The ale here was refined, carefully brewed, often flavoured with spices or imported hops. The gentry treated their morning beer like a fine tonic, something medicinal, virtuous even. They called it a fortifying draught or morning relief, as if drinking before breakfast were an act of national service. The conversation was as stiff as the collars, weather, horses, politics, all delivered with the calm assurance of people who'd never had to hurry anywhere. If the ale went flat, a servant was blamed. If the conversation did, another round was poured. For the lower classes there was no such ceremony as just necessity. Their mornings began before sunrise, in cottages that smelled of sweat and soot, not smoked ham and silver polish. The beer they drank was small, weak, often homemade, and gulped rather than sipped. A bricklayer might take his pint before heading to the work site. A weaver might drink while stoking her loom fire. It wasn't indulgence, it was fuel. The beer wasn't there to be admired, it was there to keep you upright until midday. No toasts, no tablecloths, just a nod to the mug and a muttered prayer that today's batch didn't taste like last week's socks. Still, both worlds shared one thing, dependence. The aristocrat needed beer to ease into his day of leisure, the labourer needed it to survive his day of labour. But the cultural meanings couldn't have been more opposite. For the wealthy, beer at breakfast was a symbol of continuity and heritage, a civilised holdover from medieval tradition. For the working class, it was a survival mechanism. The rich toasted to family honour, the poor toasted to not starving. There's a certain irony in how the gentry romanticise what for everyone else was just endurance. Manuals of etiquette from the era offered advice like, "A gentleman may take his beer at breakfast, but only with moderation and meat," as though the lower orders were secretly having keg parties at dawn. In truth, the working man's morning pint was closer to medicine than merriment. When your day began with 12 hours of hard labour and ended with an aching spine, Moderation was for people who didn't sweat. Back at the manor, breakfast lingered on. The master of the house might discuss estate finances, while his wife daintily nibbled a sweet roll and sipped ale infused with nutmeg, the Georgian equivalent of a pumpkin spice latte. Children, if present, were expected to sit quietly and absorb the family's elegance, though most probably daydreamed about escaping to the stables where the talk was looser and the beer stronger. By 10 o'clock, the aristocrat's biggest exertion was lifting a newspaper. The labourer by then had already burned through his first pint and was eyeing the second as the only thing standing between him and collapse. The contrast extended beyond the dining table. In cities, apprentices and servants began their work in cellars and kitchens, while their masters above them stirred their tea or ale in porcelain cups. The clang of plates below was the unseen heartbeat of Georgian luxury, a world where elegance floated on a sea of unseen labour. The same beer that comforted one class masked exhaustion in another. It's not hard to imagine a cook pausing in the scullery, taking a quick gulp of ale before carrying another tray of delicacies she'd never taste. In the countryside, the rhythm was just as divided. A farmer drank his beer standing, a landowner drank his sitting. The difference wasn't taste, it was time. The poor didn't linger because lingering meant less bread, less work, less chance of surviving the next winter. The rich could philosophise over hops and barley while the people who harvested both trudged on. Beer, for all its universality, revealed the fault lines of Georgian society with every swallow. And yet, strangely, both sides would have claimed beer as part of their identity. It was one of the few things that transcended class, even as it reinforced it. The manor's ale and the tavern's pint might never meet, but both defined what it meant to be British, industrious, proud, and perpetually on the edge of intoxication. It was a shared ritual, divided by circumstance but united in spirit, a national toast that somehow meant something different in every glass. So when an aristocrat raised his cup and murmured, "To health and prosperity," somewhere a labourer lifted his own, muttering, "To getting through the day." Both took a drink, both needed it. One called it fortifying the spirit, the other called it Tuesday. Imagine sitting down to breakfast in Georgian Britain, not the kind of breakfast that comes with orange juice and quiet contemplation, but a feast where half the meal sloshes. The table is a still life of bread loaves, cold meats, wedges of cheese and pitchers of amber beer that gleam like melted brass in the morning light. The room smells faintly of malt and roasted grain, the air thick with chatter and chewing. This was the era's most important meal of the day, though it had less to do with nutrition and more to do with announcing that you'd survived another night, and had beer to prove it. To understand Georgian breakfast, you must first forget the modern idea of what morning food looks like. Cereal didn't exist, coffee was for intellectuals, and fruit was a luxury that spoiled too fast to feel practical. What the average Briton wanted and expected was solidity: bread, meat, cheese, and something to wash it down that wouldn't give you cholera. Enter beer, the breakfast drink that did it all. In households across Britain, beer wasn't just served with breakfast. It was breakfast. A family might rise with the dawn, gather around the table, and start the day with a jug of small beer, mild, low alcohol, but rich with calories. It was the drink of farmers, servants, apprentices, and occasionally even children, who were taught to sip responsibly, meaning don't spill it on the Bible. For many, this liquid loaf was the only reliable nutrition of the day. If life was a daily battle, beer was the armour that went on first. Among the middle and upper classes, however, breakfast was less about survival and more about performance. Picture a London townhouse in 1770, a mahogany table covered in polished silver, porcelain cups, and crystal glasses that refract the morning light like a polite disco. There's bread in neat slices, boiled eggs, and cold beef arranged with military precision. At the centre stands a jug of ale, dark and foamy, poured with ceremony by a footman who looks as though he'd rather be anywhere else. The host takes a deliberate sip, not a gulp, never a gulp, and sighs in approval. The beer is crisp, refined, and likely imported. Somewhere in his mind he's congratulating himself on his impeccable taste. That was the Georgian paradox. beer was universal yet deeply coded by class. A farmer's breakfast pint came from his own brew, cloudy and warm. A gentleman's came from a reputable brewery or perhaps his own cellar, filtered and bottled with wax seals. Drinking was as much about social theatre as thirst. Guests noticed what you poured. Servants noticed how much. Etiquette books even offered advice. Beer at breakfast was acceptable, expected even, but only in moderation, and preferably before noon unless one wanted to look common. For the aristocracy, breakfast beer came with subtle rules. Light ale for mornings, porter for evenings, and strong ale for occasions, which might include weddings, victories, or realising one's wife had bought another horse. Matching beer to mood was as essential as matching your waistcoat to your stockings. The wrong choice could signal poor breeding, hence the jest whispered in drawing rooms. If your beer didn't match your outfit, were you even refined? But refinement had its limits. Some Georgian host took the breakfast table to absurd extremes. There are accounts of gentlemen's breakfasts featuring not one but 3 kinds of ale, a pale, a porter, and a strong brew, all served alongside cold ham, mutton pies, and enough butter to grease the Industrial Revolution. Guests stumbled away, not refreshed, but fortified for battle. The line between breakfast and early lunch blurred until eventually nobody cared to find it. Outside the drawing rooms, breakfast was brisker but no less important. In workshops and taverns, workers gathered for their morning pint before dispersing to their trades. Bakers, miners, and blacksmiths all shared the same ritual. One hand gripping bread, the other a mug. It was communal, comforting, and deeply British. A pint before work didn't raise eyebrows, it raised morale. Beer steadied the nerves, soothed the stomach, and made the prospect of 12 hours of toil slightly less unbearable. And yet, despite this dependence, beer retained its dignity. Unlike gin, which carried a reputation for ruin, beer remained wholesome, domestic, even patriotic. It was the drink of honest men, not rogues. Poets wrote odes to it, farmers praised it in verse. The morning pint was a mark of normalcy, the invisible handshake that connected lord and labourer, even if they never sat at the same table. Of course, the Georgian breakfast wasn't static. By the late 18th century, as trade expanded and colonies sent back exotic goods, new drinks began to creep in: tea, coffee, cocoa, each bringing a hint of novelty and foreign sophistication. But for most Britons, those were still luxuries or curiosities. Beer remained the reliable constant. Tea might wake you up, but beer kept you going. It was the liquid clock that set the rhythm of the day, one pint at a time. Even as the century turned and moral reformers began wagging fingers about morning indulgence, the beer at breakfast persisted, not out of vice but tradition. It was the same reason people still say cheers, even when drinking water. A toast to continuity, to the comforting idea that some habits, however peculiar, have survived history's hangovers. So next time you picture a Georgian breakfast, don't imagine polite sips of tea. Picture foam catching the sunlight, laughter bouncing off wooden walls, and someone proudly declaring that this beer, this particular brew, has just the right flavour to start the day. Because in Georgian Britain, breakfast wasn't about balance or health. It was about beginnings, and every good beginning started with a pint. In Georgian Britain, beer didn't just quench thirst. It announced who you were. The glass you lifted said as much about your place in society as the clothes on your back or the address on your calling card. Ale wasn't a simple pleasure. It was a liquid mirror reflecting the rigid hierarchy of the age. The rich sipped their carefully crafted brews with refined detachment, while the poor gulped down whatever murky concoction managed to survive the journey from barrel to cup. You could tell a man's fortune by the quality of his bubbles. Rich beer sparkled. Poor beer fizzed like despair. Let's start at the top, where beer wasn't so much a necessity as an ornament. Wealthy households stocked their cellars with ales of pedigree, aged, for sort of filtered and often imported. The gentry could afford the good stuff, pale ales from Burton, porters from London's best breweries, or even experimental blends infused with spices, honey, or fruit. Some brewers sent personalised casks to noble patrons, their initials branded into the wood like proof of divine right. Drinking this beer was less about pleasure than prestige. Every sip an exercise in performance. The foam had to be delicate, the temperature correct, the colour a respectable amber that gleamed like polished wood under candlelight. In drawing rooms, the beer was served from elegant jugs into glass goblets so clear you could see your self-satisfaction reflected in them. Hosts boasted of their beer the way they might boast of their horses. Ah, yes, brewed from the finest malt and aged 3 seasons in a Shropshire cask. Guests murmured polite approval, pretending to detect subtle notes of clove or heritage, though mostly they tasted power. The rich didn't drink to get drunk, they drank to demonstrate that they could afford to do so beautifully. Down in the taverns and tenements, the story was altogether different. The working poor drank what the wealthy would have poured down the drain, weak, inconsistent, and frequently adulterated. Many urban brewers, eager to stretch profits, watered down their product or padded it with less appetising additives. Molasses for colour, burnt sugar for bitterness, even sawdust or soot for body. The result? Beer that looked right but tasted like a practical joke, and yet people drank it anyway. When you earned pennies a day, your palate wasn't picky, survival was the only flavour that mattered. Street beer sellers, mostly women with tin pails, hawked their brews to labourers heading to work. They'd fill mugs from barrels perched on carts, the foam sliding down into the grime of London streets. The beer was often lukewarm, sour, or flat before it even hit the cup, but it was cheap and filling. A pint might cost a farthing, and if you couldn't afford that, the seller might top up your mug with second draw or watery residue from a barrel's bottom. It wasn't pleasant, but it kept you hydrated and faintly hopeful. The divide went deeper than flavour. The rich and poor didn't just drink different beers, they drank them differently. For the elite, beer was a private pleasure, enjoyed in polished dining rooms under chandeliers. For the labouring class, it was communal, a shared ritual performed in noisy taverns or public squares. The glassware told the story: crystal goblets versus pewter mugs, polished silver taps versus wooden spigots that leaked as much beer as they poured. Even intoxication was a class-coded act. The aristocrat grew merry, the servant got disorderly. The same amount of drink could mark one man as convivial and another as criminal. Regulation followed the prejudice. Magistrates passed laws limiting how much beer taverns could serve, often aimed squarely at the poor. Respectable alehouses catering to gentlemen were tolerated, even celebrated, while low taverns were branded dens of moral decay. The irony was bitter. The upper classes fueled the same industry they publicly condemned. The tax on malt and hops filled royal coffers, but it also kept the poorest drinkers just thirsty enough to stay desperate. In cities like London, the inequality fermented visibly. Walk down a single street and you could smell the difference. On one end, the rich enjoyed clean breweries with brick chimneys puffing out orderly smoke. On the other, the poor huddled around open barrels in alleyways, drinking small beer that had gone off 3 days ago. It wasn't just about taste, it was about dignity. The gentry had beer that improved with age. The poor had a beer that spoiled overnight. The same word, ale, covered 2 entirely different realities, much like the word breakfast did across class lines. The divide even reached the breweries themselves. The great industrial brewers of the era, Whitbread, Barclay Perkins and Truman, built empires on mass production, selling the good stuff to the wealthy while flooding poorer districts with cheaper versions. Some factories brewed multiple grades of beer from the same batch, skimming off the finest for export and leaving the dregs for the domestic poor. The workers who made the beer rarely tasted the high-quality product they bottled. Their wages barely covered the cheapest pint in the city, and yet the poor claimed beer as their own. It was the drink of the people, honest, accessible, unpretentious. In back alleys and corner taverns, men and women gathered after long days, raising chipped mugs in defiance of the world that divided them. Their beer might have been weak, but their toasts were strong. There was a kind of democracy in that shared act of drinking, however humble the brew. Beer gave them what little equality life withheld, a moment of warmth, a laugh, a song, and a sense of belonging that no fine ale could buy. So while the rich sparkled and the poor fizzed, both depended on the same golden liquid to define their days. The bubbles may have risen differently, but they burst just the same. In the end, beer didn't just taste of malt and hops, it tasted of class, privilege, and persistence. The nation's thirst for ale was as unquenchable as its appetite for hierarchy. By the mid-Georgian era, Britain's love affair with beer had grown too big for the kettle. What began as a household craft, women stirring copper pots by the hearth, had ballooned into a national obsession powered by steam profit and a questionable understanding of chemistry. The Industrial Revolution didn't just give the world locomotives and smog, it gave Britain the ability to brew enough beer to float the navy. Brewing was no longer domestic alchemy, it was industrial might in a barrel. London, with its labyrinth of taverns and its endless thirst, became the beating heart of this transformation. Rows of small alehouses were replaced by vast brick breweries with chimneys that coughed steam into the grey sky. Inside, machines hissed, vats bubbled, and men shovelled malt like coal miners of intoxication. Beer had gone mechanical, and with it came efficiency, wealth, and the faint scent of something sinister. Steam power changed everything. Where once brewing depended on muscle, fire, and instinct, it now relied on precision machinery. Pumps replaced ladles, thermometers replaced guesswork, and accountants replaced intuition. Breweries could now produce thousands of barrels a week, a staggering leap from the modest output of household brewsters. These were no longer artisans, they were industrialists. The beer that once carried the warmth of the kitchen now bore the chill of the factory floor. But with mass production came new hazards. Quality became a casualty of quantity. Brewers, eager to meet rising demand and lower costs, began experimenting, and not always safely. Adulteration was the dirty secret of industrial beer. Copper sulfate to restore colour, salt to mimic flavour, and even opium or strychnine to enhance the buzz were not unheard of. It wasn't enough for beer to be cheap, it had to look expensive. If your pint sparkled suspiciously, chances were it owed more to chemistry than craftsmanship. Newspapers occasionally broke scandals about poisoned porter or corrupted cask. One 18th century medical pamphlet warned that London's cheaper ales contained an assortment of deleterious additions. Translation: you might get drunk, but you'd also glow faintly in the dark. Still, few complained. The industrial worker couldn't afford to be picky. He wanted beer that filled his belly, dulled his aches, and fit his budget, even if it shaved a few months off his life. The giants of the brewing world, names like Whitbread, Truman, and Barclay Perkins, capitalised on this demand, building brewing empires that rivaled textile mills and steelworks in both output and prestige. They harnessed canals, carts, and later railways to move their product faster than ever before. Beer was now a national commodity, its flow measured not in mugs but in millions of gallons. The breweries themselves became architectural wonders, towering vats, gleaming brass pipes, and cellars so vast that guides offered tours. Some of these facilities were so big they employed entire neighbourhoods. Beer was no longer something you made, it was something you manufactured. And yet, industrial success brought its own dark comedy. With barrels stacked to the rafters and workers rushing to fill orders, accidents were inevitable. The most infamous struck London in 1814 when a vat at the Mew & Company brewery burst, releasing over 300,000 gallons of beer into the streets. The tidal wave of porter demolished walls, flooded basements, and reportedly drowned 8 people, one of them tragically while drinking. Locals later collected the spilled beer in pots and pans, because waste was still waste. It was the world's first and least glamorous beer tsunami, proving that Britain's relationship with alcohol had officially gone overboard. For brewers, however, profit forgave all sins. Beer taxes were high, competition fierce, and the pressure to produce relentless. Industrial brewing became a delicate dance between science and scandal. Some brewers turned to early chemistry to stabilise fermentation, experimenting with new yeasts and heating systems. Others cut corners so ruthlessly that their product barely qualified as drinkable. It was a race between innovation and intoxication, and both were winning. Workers inside the breweries faced their own version of hell. Long hours, oppressive heat, and constant exposure to fumes turned brewing into a kind of liquid servitude. Men stood ankle-deep in spilled malt, their lungs full of yeast dust, their hands stained by barley and boiling water. The pay was steady, the beer plentiful, and the life expectancy debatable. Still, it beat the workhouse, and most workers took comfort in the free beer allowance, a perk that kept them loyal, tipsy, and unconcerned about labour unions. Yet despite its flaws, industrial brewing reshaped Britain's identity. Beer wasn't just a drink anymore, it was infrastructure. It linked fields of barley in Norfolk to the taverns of London, fueled trade and created a new class of wealthy brewers, businessmen who mixed malt with monopoly. They built mansions, donated to charities, and sometimes even entered Parliament, proving that you could quite literally drink your way into politics. What had once been a homemade ritual of survival had become a global enterprise. The warm, yeasty soul of beer was now harnessed by steam and profit, packaged in casks stamped with corporate pride. The irony was inescapable. The very drink that had once symbolised community now symbolised capitalism. A pint of beer, once a comfort at dawn, was now a product of empire, standardised, distributed, and, if you were unlucky, slightly toxic. So yes, progress meant you could now get drunk faster and die cheaper. But it also meant Britain's national drink had found its industrial destiny, bubbling away in iron vats, keeping a country afloat on froth, fumes, and faith in modernity. Before juice boxes, milk cartons, or lunchtime sodas, there was beer. In Georgian Britain, even the schoolyard was slightly drunk. Picture it, rows of wooden desks, quill pens scratching across parchment, and at each child's side, not a water bottle, but a small mug of frothy small beer. No one blinked. It was as normal as arithmetic. Drink your ale and mind your sums was the unspoken rule of the classroom. After all, how else could you survive long division in a century where even the ink smelled faintly of yeast? The idea wasn't as scandalous to Georgians as it sounds to us. Beer was seen as food, not vice, a breakfast staple that kept children strong and settled. It contained barley, calories, and a whisper of alcohol, which parents insisted helped the blood. Given that water was a microbial minefield, beer seemed downright medicinal. Schoolmasters encouraged it, parents packed it, and children, well, didn't complain. Nothing says education like spelling lessons after 2 pints. A typical school morning began with prayers, lessons, and, inevitably, refreshments. The term beer break was not a joke, but a timetable entry. In charity schools and parish classrooms, pupils as young as 6 were allowed to drink during recess. Small beer, being weak and nourishing, was considered ideal. The same logic applied to milk, except that milk spoiled while beer improved with age, at least in theory. Teachers kept barrels in storerooms, drawing mugs between lessons, often sampling a little themselves for supervision purposes. If you're imagining classrooms full of giggling, hiccuping children, you wouldn't be far off. Accounts from the period mention pupils nodding off mid-recitation, their handwriting growing progressively wobblier as the morning wore on. Yet no one found this alarming. Drowsiness was considered a sign of satisfaction, not intoxication. The beer wasn't meant to excite, it was meant to pacify. A class of slightly tipsy children was, by Georgian standards, a well-behaved class. The practice extended beyond basic education. Apprentices, too, were given beer allowances. Blacksmiths' boys, young weavers, and shipyard trainees all received daily rations, not as indulgence but incentive. Beer made work tolerable and, to some extent, survivable. Employers saw it as part of the wage, a perk that kept morale high and hydration steady. A dry apprentice was an unproductive one. Some workshops even built in formal beer breaks, complete with assigned drinking times and company-issued mugs, Modern HR departments would faint. In boarding schools for the upper classes, the routine was more refined but no less soaked. Young gentlemen, future politicians, clergymen and officers were served beer with breakfast and supper, sometimes accompanied by cold meat or porridge. Tea was slowly gaining ground, but many schoolmasters distrusted it as foreign and weakening. Beer, they argued, built character. One headmaster reportedly declared, "A boy who begins his day with ale will not shrink from life's labours." Judging by the number of Georgian politicians caught asleep in Parliament, he may have been right. Even girls' schools joined the trend. Though their rations were smaller, many received small beer at mealtimes. It was thought to aid digestion and complexion because nothing says ladylike education like a pre-luncheon pint. Some etiquette guides even advise mothers to accustom their daughters early, lest they appear ungracious when offered ale in polite company. In a society where drinking was social glue, early initiation was a form of training. Georgian childhood, in other words, came with foam on top. Of course, not all beer served in schools was good beer. Cheap suppliers often sold barrels that were half sour before arrival. There are stories of schoolmasters opening a cask only to discover the contents had turned into something resembling porridge with an attitude. Still, wasting it was unthinkable. The solution? Mix it with bread or oatmeal and call it nourishing broth. Children probably didn't notice the difference. They were too busy reciting Latin while burping barley. The cultural acceptance of beer for children also reflected a broader mistrust of abstinence. To refuse ale was considered strange, even suspicious. Moderation was fine, but total avoidance hinted at moral weakness or, worse, dissent. Even the smallest lad must learn to drink like an Englishman, one London pamphleteer proclaimed in 1782. Beer wasn't just a beverage, it was a badge of belonging. To raise a sober child was, in a way, to raise an outsider. Over time, reformers began to notice that maybe, just maybe, constant childhood drinking wasn't ideal. Early health campaigners like Jonas Hanway and physicians in London hospitals observed that children who drank beer daily often suffered from digestive issues and lethargy. One doctor delicately noted that learning and liquor do not harmonise. Temperance voices began whispering that perhaps the classroom needed fewer barrels and more clean wells. But in a country still plagued by polluted water, those whispers were drowned out by the sound of another tap opening. Still, the cracks were forming. As tea became more affordable and industrial sanitation slowly improved, the idea of beer for breakfast, even in schools, began to fade. By the early 19th century, many institutions quietly phased out beer rations, replacing them with milk or weak tea. A few stubborn schools held out, citing tradition, until parents began asking awkward questions like, "Why does my son come home singing sea shanties?" Looking back, the image of Georgian schoolchildren swigging beer between lessons seems absurd, yet oddly fitting. It was a society that believed in practicality over purity, comfort over caution. Beer wasn't corrupting, it was comforting. The line between childhood and adulthood blurred in a haze of hops and good intentions. In their minds, they weren't giving children alcohol, they were giving them survival. So the next time you see a child clutching a juice box, imagine that same scene in 1780, except the box is a pewter mug, the juice is small beer, and the recess bell means it's time for another round. Education, Georgian style, slightly sticky, faintly boozy, and blissfully unaware of irony. For all the barrels, bubbles, and bravado, the Georgians had absolutely no idea why beer worked. They brewed by instinct, not intellect, guided by taste, texture, and the vague hope that the batch wouldn't explode. To them, fermentation was less a scientific process and more a divine mystery, a kind of miracle that happened in the dark while nobody was looking. They didn't understand yeast, bacteria, or the chemical dance inside their barrels. They simply knew that when grain, water, and time met, something marvellous and mildly intoxicating occurred. They called it working, as if the beer itself rolled up its sleeves and got on with it. A brewer could tell his batch was alive when bubbles began to rise, the surface foaming like a miniature storm. To the modern eye, that's yeast converting sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. To the Georgian brewer, it was magic, or possibly witchcraft. Some even whispered that the beer needed to breathe, as if it were a moody pet. And in a way it was, temperamental, unpredictable, and prone to spoiling the moment you got confident. Fermentation wasn't measured in temperature or pressure, but in patience and prayer. Brewers relied on weather, season, and luck. A warm week could send a batch sour. A cold snap could halt it altogether. If the yeast refused to wake, there was little to be done but sulk and blame the maltster. The truly desperate tried to revive sluggish beer by stirring it with a copper spoon, throwing in extra yeast. Or, in one famous recipe, reciting the Lord's Prayer over the vat. Whether this helped or just improved morale is lost to history. What makes this ignorance so fascinating is that by sheer accident, Georgians stumbled into one of the most effective sanitation systems in history. Boiling the mash killed pathogens, while the fermentation process created alcohol, an antimicrobial substance that stopped new ones from growing. The yeast also lowered the drink's pH, turning beer into an environment hostile to disease. In other words, beer wasn't healthy because they designed it to be, it was healthy despite their best efforts. Civilization survived on dumb luck and barley. If you'd asked an 18th century brewer what made good beer good, you'd get answers that sound poetic but not remotely scientific. The mash must sing, one might say. The foam must rise like morning bread. Another might insist the ale was ready when it whispers, not hisses. Brewing was less chemistry, more mythology. Barley had character, hops had temperament, and yeast, which no one could see, had attitude. Some brewers swore that certain people's presence could ruin a batch. A grumpy neighbour, an unlucky visitor, or, heaven forbid, a menstruating woman. Science, it was not. The real breakthrough in understanding wouldn't come until a century later, when Louis Pasteur peered through his microscope and declared that fermentation was the work of living organisms. But in Georgian Britain, that idea would have sounded like heresy. The thought that tiny invisible creatures were responsible for their favourite beverage was too strange to contemplate. "Bugs making beer?" they'd scoff. "Next you'll tell us they make bread rise." Which of course they did, but Georgian science preferred divine mystery to microbial mischief. Still, empirical knowledge did exist, a kind of folk chemistry learned through endless trial and error. Brewers knew that good yeast came from successful batches, so they saved it carefully, skimming it off and storing it for future brews. They recognised that certain barrels produced better results, that copper kettles yielded cleaner flavours than iron ones, and that sunlight was a deadly enemy to fermentation. None of this was explained, it was observed. Brewing knowledge passed through generations like sacred scripture, memorised but rarely questioned. As industrial brewing took off, this empirical wisdom collided with emerging science. Thermometers and hydrometers began appearing in breweries, allowing for more consistent control of mash temperatures and sugar content. To older brewers, these instruments were suspicious contraptions, gadgets for the men who didn't trust their noses. But for younger ones, they offered precision and predictability in a trade that had long depended on guesswork. The age of intuition was slowly giving way to the age of measurement. Even so, much remained mysterious. When beer turned, brewers blamed everything from the weather to the cooper who made the barrel. Bad luck, bad wood, bad vibes, anything but bacteria. Some even believed that certain songs sung during brewing affected the outcome, a superstition that led to the wonderfully absurd image of grown men humming lullabies to their ale. Fermentation by melody might not have been effective science, but it was excellent company. Ironically, this ignorance helped preserve beer's charm. Brewing wasn't just an industry, it was an act of faith. Every batch carried a touch of uncertainty, a reminder that nature still held some cards. For all their machinery and expansion, brewers remained at the mercy of invisible forces they couldn't explain. Beer worked not because Georgians understood it, but because the world was kind enough not to punish their confusion. And so the Georgian brewer, part craftsman, part conjurer, stood over his bubbling vat, nodding solemnly as foam rose and the room filled with the smell of barley and hope. He didn't know about enzymes, amino acids, or yeast reproduction, but he did know that beer meant life, and life, however unpredictable, was best lived with a pint in hand. They didn't need microscopes to see that beer kept the nation alive. They had evidence in every street, every tavern, every family table. You didn't need to understand fermentation to trust it, you just needed to drink it. And Georgians, as history shows, were more than happy to participate in that grand experiment. After all, they didn't know why beer kept you alive. They just knew it worked better than God's other beverage, swamp soup. There was a time when Britain's beer flowed from women's hands. Before the soot and steam of industrial brewing took over, the alewife or brewster was a fixture of every village. She brewed, sold and sustained communities, her barrels a kind of household lifeline. But by the late Georgian age, the comforting scent of malt simmering in kitchens was fading. The copper kettles were going cold. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how beer was made, it changed who made it. For centuries, brewing was women's invisible empire. The wife brewed for her household, the widow brewed for income, and the clever ones brewed for the whole town. It was messy, physical work, hauling water, stirring mash, skimming foam, but it belonged to them. Women brewed while gossiping with neighbours, while nursing infants, while managing every other domestic miracle of survival. Brewing was simply part of being alive, as ordinary as baking bread. And it brought respect. A good brewster could command customers, reputation and steady profit, all rare forms of independence in a patriarchal world. Then came the machines. The Georgian century, with its passion for industry, looked at beer and saw not comfort, but potential. As brewing scaled up into a booming business, it moved out of the home and into the factory, a space women were not welcome. The process that once depended on intuition now required investment, equipment and paperwork. Brewing became less about skill and more about ownership. The moment beer needed a ledger, men showed up. Breweries sprouted across London and the Midlands, vast complexes of vats and chimneys, each one run by men in waistcoats who spoke the new language of progress. Volume, capital, yield. The alewife, once the neighbourhood authority, became an anachronism. Her wooden paddle was replaced by steel levers, her recipes by measured formulas. In a few short decades, brewing went from women's work to a gentleman's industry. It was as if someone had poured patriarchy directly into the mashed tun. This transition wasn't just economic, it were cultural. Industrialization rebranded beer from domestic nourishment to commercial product, and with that rebranding came respectability. Brewing was suddenly a matter of science, machinery, and empire, a man's domain. Women who had carried the craft through centuries of famine, plague, and chaos were quietly erased. Their contributions were dismissed as quaint tradition, like churning butter or herbal medicine, useful once but no longer relevant. Even the language changed. Brewster, a once common term, faded from use, replaced by the genderless brewer, though everyone knew who that really meant. Trade guilds and brewing associations excluded women entirely, citing moral propriety and physical limitation, as if women hadn't been hefting boiling kettles since before some of these men had learned to hold a quill. The irony was almost poetic. An industry born in women's kitchens now claimed that women were too fragile for the work. The great breweries built by men became monuments of progress and exclusion. Families like the Whitbreads and Barclays rose to prominence, their names etched into the city skyline, their fortunes brewed on the backs of men who had once learned their craft from mothers and wives. The factories churned out millions of gallons of beer, all taxed, regulated, and advertised. Beer had become the empire's proud export, but its matriarchal roots were gone, buried beneath the soot of modernisation. It's tempting to imagine the displaced brewsters watching this shift with a mix of awe and bitterness. Some adapted, continuing to brew small batches for local sale, defying the new professional standards. Others were forced to abandon the trade entirely. As beer became commercialised, licences and taxes tightened around it. Subtle economic tools designed, whether intentionally or not, to push out those without capital. Brewing had once been freedom for women. Now it was another locked door. The loss rippled beyond economics. Women's brewing knowledge, practical chemistry learned through centuries of trial and error, was largely dismissed. Recipes passed down through generations vanished as new industrial techniques replaced them. Some of the traditional English styles, like mild ales and herbal groots, disappeared with them, casualties of efficiency. Beer lost a bit of its humanity, the domestic warmth that made it more than a drink. Meanwhile, men turned beer into spectacle. Advertising appeared, promoting masculine imagery, hearty workmen, portly gentlemen, proud landlords. Beer, once the mother's gift of nourishment, became the father's emblem of strength. The public house replaced the home as the centre of drinking, further cementing male dominance over a culture that had once been communal. You could trace the gender divide in every pint poured. Women brewed for survival, men brewed for empire, and of course, where there's male monopoly, there's government attention. Taxes on beer soared. Official regulations flooded the industry, requiring permits, inspections, and accounts. The homebrew that once escaped notice now faced penalties. It wasn't enough that men had taken over brewing, they brought bureaucracy along for the ride. As one pamphleteer quipped in 1790, beer, like virtue, is best preserved by men of standing, which is a polite way of saying, we took it, and now you'll pay for it. So yes, men took over, and suddenly beer got an instruction manual and a tax. Industrial progress was hailed as triumph, but it left behind a quieter tragedy, the erasure of women from one of humanity's oldest crafts. The world gained consistency but lost character. It gained precision but lost intimacy. The brewster's songs, her careful touch, her instinctive timing all vanished into the steam. And yet, every pint still carries a trace of her. In the warmth, the comfort, the unspoken promise that beer, at its core, is still about community. The empire may have industrialized it, but it was women who made it indispensable. They brewed the first survival, the first celebration, and the first hangover, and they did it without blueprints, thermometers, or taxmen. Every empire needs fuel. For Rome, it was bread. For the British, it was beer. By the height of the Georgian era, Britain's labouring class was essentially powered by barley, an entire workforce running on mild intoxication, grinding through 12-hour shifts while hovering in that perfect state between cheerful and unsteady. The empire that would dominate global trade, colonise continents, and revolutionise industry did so with a faint smell of hops on its breath. The typical Georgian worker started the day early, long before the sun rose, with a pint of small beer in hand. It wasn't a luxury, it was logistics. Beer was calories, hydration and anaesthesia all in one. In the docks, the clatter of chains mixed with the clink of mugs. At the mills, the rhythmic pounding of looms echoed alongside the occasional belch. At the shipyards, men hauled timber and iron to the tune of sea shanties sung slightly off-key because everyone had already had 3 pints before noon. Beer was not just tolerated in the workplace, it was expected. Employers provided daily rations to keep their labourers functioning. The reasoning was simple. A worker with beer was a worker who didn't collapse from thirst, revolt from fatigue, or start asking difficult questions about wages. The small breweries that supplied these rations thrived near every port, foundry and textile factory. It was industrial symbiosis. The workers built the empire's infrastructure, and the beer kept them too mellow to complain about it. The docks of London, Bristol and Liverpool reeked of molten sweat, a cocktail of human effort and hops. Porters unloaded barrels of beer to fuel the men unloading barrels of beer. It was a perfect feedback loop of productivity and drunkenness. Shipbuilders routinely received an allowance of up to a gallon of beer a day, parcelled out at intervals. Each pint marked a phase of labour, one to start, one for mid-morning, one at lunch, one at quitting time, and one for the road that often led to another road entirely, usually the one back to the tavern. Factories, too, had their own beer culture. In textile mills, workers carried mugs between machines, careful not to spill foam into the spindles. The beer wasn't strong, but it was constant, the hum of fermentation as integral to the mill as the drone of looms. Overseers even used beer rations as incentives. Finish this section and you'll have your pint. It was the Georgian version of an employee bonus, except the reward made you slightly worse at your job afterward. It wasn't only the working class, though. The middle class, clerks, merchants, even the government staff, drank steadily through the day. Office hours were punctuated by pub visits disguised as meetings. Parliament itself often resembled a tavern with better upholstery. Members of Parliament debated tax reforms with ale in hand, occasionally slurring through speeches on fiscal responsibility, while personally representing the nation's deficit in sobriety. Britain's industrial and political engines both ran on froth. For all the jokes, there was method to this madness. Beer was genuinely safer than most alternatives. Water from wells or streams was unpredictable, and strong spirits like gin turned workers unmanageable. Beer struck the perfect balance. It relaxed the body, dulled the aches, and kept everyone hydrated enough to swing a hammer without accidentally starting a revolution. Employers knew this. Many included beer in labour contracts, itemised right alongside wages. In some factories, workers were even paid partly in pints, a practice that blurred the line between compensation and addiction. This daily buzz had social consequences. It created a culture of tolerance for constant mild intoxication. Being tipsy was not a sin, it was a sign of stamina. Drunkenness, in moderation, was seen as a working man's badge of honour. A sober labourer was viewed with suspicion. Too quiet, too serious, perhaps even dangerous. The phrase, "he works well on beer," was high praise, implying someone who could hold his drink and still hit his quota. Georgian Britain's motto could have been productivity through Pilsner, and remarkably, it worked. Despite the haze of hops, the docks ran, the mills hummed, and ships launched on schedule most of the time. There were mishaps, of course. A dockhand might accidentally roll a barrel into the river or forget which end of a plank was supposed to be nailed. But the empire pressed on. The British work ethic was legendary not because of its sobriety, but in spite of its lack thereof. Beer also acted as social glue. Shared pints built solidarity among labourers, creating a sense of camaraderie that helped them endure brutal hours and meagre pay. Taverns near workplaces became informal union halls long before unions existed, places where grievances were aired, jokes traded, and songs invented. In a strange way, beer fostered both obedience and quiet resistance. The same drink that kept workers compliant also gave them the courage to grumble together about their masters. Even the military was no exception. Soldiers and sailors were granted daily beer rations, not just as comfort, but as policy. The Royal Navy considered beer essential to morale and nutrition. A soldier might go without clean socks, but never without ale. When the Empire marched, it did so with a wagon of barrels trailing behind. Britain didn't just conquer half the planet while slightly buzzed, it colonised it one keg at a time. Of course, reformers eventually began to frown on this liquid lifestyle. By the late Georgian and early Victorian periods, temperance advocates started whispering that perhaps the empire could function on tea instead of taverns. But for most of the 18th century, beer was Britain's unofficial labour policy, its simulant, sedative, and social contract all poured into one wooden mug. It's easy now to laugh at a society that built an empire while perpetually tipsy, but maybe that's exactly what made it work. The right mix of courage, confidence, and forgetfulness. Beer dulled the pain of progress and softened the edges of ambition. The Industrial Revolution might have invented the machine, but beer kept the humans inside it from breaking down completely. Britain may have conquered half the planet while slightly buzzed. Impressive, if not entirely straight. But then again, perhaps history has always been written by those sober enough to remember it. It began as a murmur, a few nervous voices rising above the clinking of tankards. In a nation where beer was as sacred as the Bible and more reliable than water, to question the pint was to question civilization itself. And yet, by the late Georgian era, a handful of moralists, doctors, and very brave clergymen began whispering a dangerous idea. Maybe we shouldn't be drunk all the time. The notion landed about as well as a sermon in a tavern. Britain, after all, was a country built on barley. To attack beer was to attack breakfast, health, family, and national identity all at once. The average Briton drank as naturally as he breathed, and probably more often. So when a reformer stood up in a town hall and declared that perhaps a pint before work wasn't strictly necessary, he might as well have announced that gravity was optional. Still, something was shifting. Industrial cities were swelling with workers, and public drunkenness was becoming harder to ignore. Streets reeked of spilled ale, fights broke out over half pints, and factory foremen discovered that beer motivation occasionally led to missing fingers and broken looms. A few thinkers began connecting the dots. Maybe a nation perpetually tipsy couldn't run its shiny new machines properly. It wasn't just morality, it was logistics. Doctors joined the chorus, though their arguments were creative. One London physician warned that constant beer consumption led to softened organs and melancholic vapours, which sounds poetic but probably meant cirrhosis. Another claimed that beer made the eyes muddy and the moral compass spineless. These early medical crusaders didn't have modern data, but they had metaphors, and that counted for a lot in the age of pamphlets. Then came the preachers, with pulpits as their platforms and eternal damnation as their marketing strategy. They began attacking Britain's daily buzz. "Drunkenness is the devil's yeast," thundered one reverend in Manchester. "A pint before prayer is a pint too many," cried another in Bristol. The sermons were loud, the congregations hung over, and progress was slow. Because really, imagine trying to preach sobriety to a man holding his breakfast pint. Brave souls indeed. But the message, however unpopular, began to resonate with a small, uneasy crowd, particularly among the rising middle classes who wanted to distinguish themselves from the coarser habits of labourers. Respectability was becoming fashionable. Clean shirts, polite conversation, and increasingly moderation. The well-to-do didn't want to reek of beer. They wanted to smell faintly of imported tea. Sobriety became a social statement, a liquid form of virtue signalling. The temperance whisper also found unlikely allies in women, who bore the brunt of Britain's drinking problem. While men laughed and staggered through the streets, it was wives and mothers who dealt with the consequences. Empty wages, broken dishes, and louder than average husbands. In homes where beer had gone from sustenance to scourge, sobriety sounded less like moralism and more like survival. Women couldn't yet vote, but they could organise, and the early temperance movement gave them one of their first public voices. Still, in the 1790s and early 1800s, full abstinence was too radical for most. The earliest reformers didn't demand people stop drinking. They simply begged them to drink less. Pamphlets circulated urging moderation. Drink for strength, not for stupor. Societies formed with charmingly naive pledges like, "I will not be drunk on weekdays." It was progress, technically. The word temperance itself didn't mean total abstinence yet, just restraint. A pint, not 3. A buzz, not a blackout. It was a start. Of course, tavern owners hated it. Preachers could talk all they wanted, but the economy still ran on ale. Breweries employed thousands, taxes on beer filled the royal treasury, and pubs remained the backbone of British social life. The idea of a sober nation seemed almost treasonous. Who would pay for the wars, the ships, the empire itself, if not the pint? LA was patriotism in liquid form. Even reformers knew better than to attack beer outright. Instead, they targeted excess, hoping moderation could be sold as good citizenship, and so pamphlets spread like confetti. The sin of excess ale, moral decline in the barrel, on the virtue of clear heads and clean hands. Some were moral appeals, others tried statistics, claiming drunkenness caused half the crimes in London, which, to be fair, might have been true. Reformers stood on corners handing out tracts to men who were already tipsy and using them to wipe their mouths. Still, every whisper counted. The idea of temperance also appealed to a new kind of British identity, modern, industrious, efficient. Sobriety wasn't just holy, it was useful. A sober worker was faster, a sober soldier sharper, a sober clerk less likely to fall asleep on his ledger. In this sense, temperance wasn't anti-progress, it was the next stage of it. The Industrial Revolution had given Britain machines. Now reformers wanted to make the humans running them equally well-oiled. Of course, the movement didn't spread evenly. In taverns, reformers were still treated as comedy acts. One travelling preacher reportedly tried giving a speech outside a London alehouse, only for patrons to pelt him with stale rolls and shout, "You can't spell Britain without beer," which, though factually incorrect, was passionately delivered. Yet even among the jeers, some ears listened. The whisper of temperance was beginning to hum. It would take decades before those whispers became a roar, before the Victorian crusade for abstinence swept across the nation with pamphlets, rallies and judgmental stares. But here, in the late Georgian dawn, it all began. The first cautious suggestion that perhaps Britain's greatness didn't require a hangover. For now the reformers were few and the pints many, but change, like fermentation, begins quietly, one bubble at a time. If there was one thing guaranteed to unite Georgian Britain, it wasn't patriotism, religion, or even fear of France. It was the collective outrage at anyone daring to make beer more expensive. Politicians could tamper with laws, liberty, and even marriage custom, but touch the pint and the nation would riot. Beer wasn't merely a drink, it was Britain's liquid right, its edible currency, its emotional support beverage. And when government saw gold at the bottom of the mug, the people saw red. From the earliest days of the Hanoverian dynasty, British rulers had discovered a simple, lucrative truth. The more the nation drank, the richer the treasury became. Beer was the perfect taxable commodity, universal, measurable, and impossible to smuggle easily, at least without smelling of, oh yes. So Parliament did what parliaments do best. It found a way to make everyone's joy slightly more expensive. The first big blow came in the late 17th century and continued into the 18th, when beer duties became a staple of national finance. The country was perpetually at war, first with the Dutch, then the French, then practically everyone, and war costs money. Cannons, ships, and colonial adventures all demanded funding, and rather than raising income taxes on the wealthy, the government chose the easier path, taxing the thirst of the masses. Every pint poured helped pay for another musket ball. It was democracy, Georgian style. Everyone contributed equally, one hangover at a time. At first, the taxes were manageable, a halfpenny here, a shilling there. But by the mid-18th century, the rates kept climbing, and people began to notice. Beer prices rose sharply, wages did not, and suddenly the working man's comfort became a luxury. When brewers passed the cost to consumers, resentment brewed faster than the ale itself. "Why should my beer pay for their wars?" grumbled the labourers. "'Cause your beer causes them," muttered Parliament. The tension boiled over more than once. London's taverns turned into rumour mills, buzzing with complaints about the tax on the poor man's pleasure. Pamphleteers mocked ministers as barley bandits and hop thieves. Riots occasionally erupted near breweries, where angry drinkers accused owners of collusion with the crown. It was one of history's great ironies. The government relied on beer to pacify the masses, yet taxing it made them furious. Smuggling, always a national pastime, adapted accordingly. Enter the moon brewer. In barns, basements and back rooms, illegal beer production flourished. Home brewers dodged taxes by brewing after hours, literally under moonlight, selling cheap, unlicensed ale to taverns eager for profit. Some even disguised their operations as bakeries. After all, bread and beer share the same aroma, and the authorities weren't known for their subtlety. The trade became so rampant that excise officers developed new ranks specifically for sniffing out illegal hops. It was less glamorous than piracy, but just as profitable. The government naturally doubled down. Inspectors raided taverns, checked barrels, and demanded receipts for every pint sold. They measured vats, counted casks, and even confiscated yeast, as if rebellion itself might be brewing in the foam. This only inflamed public opinion further. To the average Briton, the exciseman was worse than the tax collector, the devil, and the mother-in-law combined. More than one inspector found himself chased down cobbled streets by a mob armed with tankards and enthusiasm. The protests weren't just drunken rabble. The beer tax struck at the heart of Britain's identity. Beer was seen as wholesome, national and godly, unlike gin, that foreign, ruinous spirit of the slums. To tax beer was to insult decency itself. One pamphlet argued that ale is the Englishman's blood. To drain it is tyranny. Another declared, "He who lessens our beer lessens our being." The rhetoric bordered on revolutionary. You could almost picture the slogan on a banner, "No taxation without inebriation." The riots of 1760 and 1761 in particular revealed how combustible the issue had become. Crowds stormed breweries, broke barrels, and poured beer into the streets rather than let it be taxed. It was the only protest in history that literally soaked the roads in revolution. The authorities, fearing escalation, often backed down, at least temporarily. No politician wanted to go down in history as the man who killed beer. Meanwhile, brewers themselves were caught in a paradox. They hated the taxes, but loved the monopoly they created. Higher prices drove out small competitors, leaving the field to large industrial brewers who could afford the fees. Thus, the tax that angered drinkers also consolidated the brewing empires of London. Men like Samuel Whitbread grew rich under a system everyone claimed to despise. It was capitalism in its purest Georgian form. Complain loudly, profit quietly. The beer tax issue lingered like a hangover well into the 19th century. Each new rate rise was met with the same outrage, the same cries of betrayal. Politicians promised reform, then quietly raised duties again to fund another war or railway. It became a grim national cycle. The government taxed beer, the people rioted, the government blamed public disorder, and then taxed beer again to pay for extra police. But beneath the chaos was a deeper truth. The beer tax riots showed something remarkable about Georgian Britain, that ordinary people could and would defend their simple pleasures with passion and pint glasses raised high. For all its absurdity, the struggle over beer was about more than money. It was about dignity. In a world of rigid hierarchies, the pint was one of the few things that belonged to everyone. Taxing it felt like stealing a piece of joy itself. So whenever Parliament debated yet another duty, every tavern in Britain held its breath and its pint. Because if there was one thing the government should have learned, it was this: raise the beer tax, and Britain raised pitchforks. For centuries beer ruled Britain's cup, safe, familiar, mildly respectable. Then out of nowhere a clear, fiery intruder arrived and declared war on breakfast. Gin. It was cheap, potent, and utterly devastating. While beer had long lulled the population into a gentle golden buzz, gin threw open the tavern doors and shouted, "Why sip when you can vanish your problems in one gulp?" The Georgians didn't know it yet, but they were about to stumble headfirst into one of history's greatest hangovers, and it would last decades. It started innocently enough. In the late 17th century, gin, or Geneva as it was first known, drifted over from the Netherlands, carried by soldiers who thought it excellent for courage and colder mornings. It was grain-based, flavoured with juniper, and easier to make than proper beer. Distilling didn't require years of skill or the giant copper vats of brewing. All you needed was a pot, some grain, and poor judgment. When Parliament encouraged domestic distillation to reduce reliance on French brandy, and incidentally to annoy France, the gates of intoxication flew open. By the early 1700s, Britain was drowning in gin. The government, in its infinite optimism, believed this would create new industry and steady tax revenue. Instead, it created a national meltdown. Anyone could make gin, and almost everyone did. Blacksmiths, bakers, midwives, even barbers tried their hand at distilling. The result was less craft spirit and more flammable experiment. Some batches were laced with turpentine for flavour, others with sulphuric acid for bite. One historian dryly noted that to drink London gin was to gamble with one's sight. And the odds weren't good. At first, beer fought back. It had history, flavour, and the loyalty of the working class. But gin had one unbeatable advantage: speed. It got you drunk fast. While beer filled the belly and soothed the nerves, gin took the direct route to oblivion. It didn't care about craftsmanship or social rituals. It was the shortcut to not feeling anything at all. Beer made you late to work. Gin made you forget you had a job. The poor embraced it with a vengeance. Gin was cheap, unregulated, and available on every corner. London's alleys became jungles of makeshift distilleries and street vendors hawking the drink under charming names like Lady's Delight and Cuckold's Comfort. Housewives drank it to numb exhaustion. Labourers drank it to survive their shifts. Even children were given thimblefuls for their nerves. The city that once woke gently to the smell of malt now reeked of juniper and despair. This explosion became known, dramatically but accurately, as the gin craze. By the 1730s, gin consumption had reached levels that alarmed even the most lenient observers. Records suggest that, at its height, Londoners drank an average of 2 pints of gin per person per week. That doesn't sound catastrophic until you realise that half the population was too poor to buy any. In certain districts, gin shops outnumbered houses. You could stumble from one doorway to another without ever sobering up. One satirical pamphlet described the city as a place where every street has its own distillery, every child its own hangover. The government, realising it had accidentally turned the nation into a social experiment in self-destruction, panicked. Laws were passed to curb gin sales, licensing fees, production limits, fines. But enforcement was a joke. The first Gin Act of 1729 only made the drink more profitable for smugglers. People brewed it in bathtubs, in basements, even in coffins, which were conveniently shaped and always available. When a tax collector came knocking, a good distiller simply poured boiling gin on him. Moralists and artists joined the crusade. William Hogarth's famous engraving Gin Lane depicted a city collapsing under intoxication, a skeletal mother dropping her baby, corpses littering the streets, and a barber's sign reading, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for two." It wasn't far from the truth. Gin had turned poverty into pandemonium. Birth rates fell, death rates soared, and the beer brewers, bless them, watched in horrified silence as their mild, nourishing product lost ground to the liquid apocalypse next door. Meanwhile, the tavern keepers adapted. Those who once sold beer now stocked gin because it sold faster and took up less space. A pint of ale was bulky. A shot of gin was tidy profit. The great irony was that gin was technically taxed less than beer per unit of alcohol, a bureaucratic oversight that made vice cheaper than virtue. The working class didn't need much encouragement to choose the faster route to forgetfulness, but gin's dominance came at a cost. Unlike beer, which softened tempers, gin sharpened them. The streets grew meaner. The crime rate rose. Magistrates complained that London was a city of madmen by moonlight. Public drunkenness was no longer funny. It was frightening. In 1751, the government finally acted decisively, passing a new Gin Act that raised taxes, increased regulation, and cracked down on unlicensed distillers. The results were immediate and explosive. Riots broke out. Gin shops were burned, inspectors attacked, and the poor howled that their only comfort had been stolen. It was, in a sense, the hangover after the national binge. When the dust settled, gin's reign began to wane. It didn't disappear. It simply retreated into respectability, later reborn as the gin and tonic of empire. But in the Georgian era, it left behind a legacy of chaos that made beer look saintly by comparison. The pint regained its moral high ground with the loyal, steady drink of patriots, not poisoners. Still, the scars of the gin invasion lingered. It had revealed something uncomfortably honest about Britain, that beneath the powdered wigs and polite society lay a thirst not for refinement, but for relief. Gin offered a escape. Beer offered stability, and the nation wavered between the two like a drunk deciding which way home was. In the end, beer survived, as it always does, precisely because it was slower. Gin burned bright and fast, but beer endured, steady, forgiving, and slightly frothy. Britain sobered up just enough to realise that an empire couldn't run on delirium. It needed something dependable, something brown, bubbly, and less likely to make you forget your children's names. There comes a moment in every civilization story when it sobers up, looks around and says, "What have we done?" For Georgian Britain, that moment arrived with the clink of porcelain cups. After centuries of beer-soaked mornings and gin-sodden nights, the nation discovered something revolutionary: caffeine. It didn't hit you like a barrel of ale or drown your problems like gin. It sharpened you, politely. Suddenly, a new kind of buzz was sweeping across the kingdom, one brewed from roasted beans and delicate leaves instead of barley and yeast. The coffeehouse revolution had technically begun a century earlier, but by the 18th century it was thriving. These new temples of thought were unlike anything Britain had ever known. No smoke-stained tavern floors, no staggering patrons, no smell of malt clinging to your coat. Instead, you entered a room that hummed with conversation, quick, witty, and coherent. The air smelled of roasted beans and ambition. The sound wasn't the clatter of tankards, but the rustle of newspapers and the polite scraping of quills. Beer built the empire, coffee wrote the essays explaining it. For the first time, mornings were about awakening the mind rather than numbing it. Men who might once have started their day with a pint of ale now nursed steaming cups of coffee, claiming it cleared the spirits. The change wasn't just chemical, it was cultural. Caffeine produced focus, not fog. Coffee didn't loosen tongues, it sharpened them. In these spaces, conversation became currency. A good argument was worth more than a good brew. And oh, the arguments. Coffee houses were the internet of their age. Noisy, opinionated, and occasionally unreliable. For a penny you could buy admission to a world of gossip, politics, and ideas. Merchants, writers, clerks, and philosophers crowded together at wooden tables, scribbling letters, debating government policy, or dissecting the latest scandal. The barista, though they didn't call him that, was less a server than a curator of chaos, keeping the cups full while the rhetoric spilled over. Each establishment developed its own flavour of clientele. Lloyd's Coffee House in London became the centre of maritime trade and insurance, the place where fortunes were made and ships were lost, both on paper. Jonathan's Coffee House was where the stock market was born, the chatter of investors turning caffeine into capital. Will's Coffee House hosted writers and poets, where Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift sparred with words sharper than any sabre. The Georgian mind was brewing as busily as the coffee. Meanwhile, tea was making its own quiet invasion. Imported from China and later India, it was initially a luxury for the wealthy, delicate, fragrant, and expensive enough to lock in cabinets. Aristocratic ladies hosted morning tea gatherings, where conversation revolved around fashion, scandal, and the latest imports. The act of serving tea itself became a performance: the porcelain teapot, the silver tongs, the graceful pour. Unlike the chaotic masculinity of the coffee house, tea culture was refined, domestic, and distinctly feminine. Together they remade British mornings. The coffee house sharpened minds, the tea table softened manners. The rise of these caffeinated institutions marked a turning point in how Britain thought, worked, and socialised. Coffee houses birthed new professions: the journalist, the critic, the intellectual. Here, news spread faster than Parliament could contain it. Pamphlets and periodicals circulated from table to table, and with every sip of coffee came another opinion. "Have you heard?" was the catchphrase of the age, and the answer was always, "Yes, And here's what I think about it. This was a sober revolution, but not a dull one, where taverns produced laughter and slurred philosophy, coffeehouses produced satire and wit. The same energy that once fueled drunken toasts now fueled printed pamphlets and political pamphleteering. Writers who might once have shouted their opinions over a pint now published them, caffeinated and clear-headed. London became a city buzzing not from alcohol but from thought, the world's first metropolis of ideas on a coffee high. Not everyone approved, of course. The clergy, naturally, suspected anything that produced joy without sin. One sermon denounced coffee houses as dens of sedition, claiming they encouraged men to think too much and question authority. He was right, which was precisely the problem. Women, too, had mixed feelings. Many complained that their husbands spent more time at coffee houses than at home. In 1674, the women's petition against coffee had already mocked the drink for turning men into useless babblers who preferred debating politics to performing other domestic duties. The men responded with a counter-pamphlet defending their right to both caffeine and conversation. It was Britain's first recorded coffee war. Yet, despite the grumbling, coffee houses flourished. They were democratic in a way that few spaces of the era were. For the price of a single cup, a merchant could argue with a nobleman, a poet could insult a politician, and a nobody could become a somebody, provided his opinions were strong enough. Here, intellect outranked income, and quick wit was currency. It was an intoxicating new kind of equality, and the only hangover was a racing heartbeat. The ripple effects were enormous. Caffeine rewired Britain's daily rhythm. Workdays began earlier and lasted longer. The empire ran on trade, and trade now ran on tea and coffee. Even the great men of state traded tankards for teacups. The Georgian politician began his day not with a breakfast ale, but with a letter, a newspaper and a mug of steaming sobriety. Slowly, respectability began to replace revelry. It's no exaggeration to say that the Enlightenment, Britain's golden age of reason, was brewed one cup at a time. Beer had built the bodies that laboured for empire, but coffee and tea built the minds that justified it. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. Britain, once famous for being perpetually drunk, found its destiny in a sober cup that made everyone a little too awake. In the Georgian imagination, beer wasn't merely a beverage, it was practically a vitamin. Doctors, apothecaries, and well-meaning relatives agreed on one thing. There was no human condition that couldn't be improved by a pint or two. Whether you suffered from melancholy, gout, weak nerves, or childbirth itself, the answer was always the same. Drink up. It was the age when ale was medicine, doctors wore wigs, and moderation was a rumour. Medicine in the 18th century was a game of confident guesses, and beer fit perfectly into that ethos. After all, it was nourishing, warm, and relatively clean. Compared to leeches, mercury, and laudanum, beer looked downright sophisticated. Physicians wrote prescriptions for a course of strong ale as casually as modern doctors might recommend paracetamol. Take 2 pints daily and rest your constitution was actual advice, and the patients, unsurprisingly, were delighted to comply. The medical justification rested on what doctors called the humours, an ancient system of bodily balance that refused to die. Beer was said to restore equilibrium between the wet, dry, hot and cold forces that allegedly governed human health. If your spirits were low, beer moistened them. If your blood was thick, beer thinned it. If your digestion was slow, beer encouraged the humours to circulate. In short, if you were alive, beer was good for you, and if you weren't, it was probably because you hadn't drunk enough. Doctors championed beer as liquid bread, a phrase that excused everything from breakfast indulgence to maternity cravings. Pregnant women were told to drink it for strength, nursing mothers for milk, and the elderly for warmth. Midwives recommended stout to enliven the womb, a phrase that deserves to be retired immediately, while manuals for expectant mothers reassured them that beer cheers the blood without disturbing the faculties. It's no wonder Georgian family portraits show generations with rosy cheeks and suspiciously content expressions. Children weren't exempt either. Paediatric advice was refreshingly consistent. Weak, Drink beer, fidgety, drink beer, beer. Teething, rub beer on the gums. It was Britain's answer to everything from sleeplessness to misbehaviour. A toddler's tantrum might end with the soothing words, "Here, sip this, doctor's orders." Childhood was a hazy mix of barley and bedtime stories. The result wasn't so much healthier kids as quieter ones. Even the clergy approved. Sermons praised beer as a temperate blessing of Providence. Unlike gin, which ruined souls, beer was thought to fortify the spirit in moderation. Clergymen drank during parish calls to endear themselves to the flock. Parishioners took this to mean that getting tipsy in good company was practically an act of faith. Religion and medicine both bless the pint, and when church and science agree on something, resistance is futile. Medical manuals of the period brimmed with beer-related remedies that now read like punchlines. To treat fainting, rub the temples with ale and offer a sip. For anxiety, a small beer in the morning clears the vapours. For digestive trouble, one strong ale before bed, repeat until comfortable. Beer was even prescribed for smallpox recovery, gout prevention, and overheated imagination, an ailment that suspiciously resembles enthusiasm. In Georgian healthcare, the cure for everything was a hangover. Of course, not all doctors were equally qualified. The line between physician and enthusiastic amateur was as blurry as a Friday night. Apothecaries mixed tonics that were half medicine, half pub menu. Country doctors brewed their own medicinal ales, adding herbs like wormwood, dandelion or licorice, often with unpredictable side effects. Patients who drank these concoctions reported feeling greatly improved right before collapsing into a cheerful nap. Hospitals too distributed beer as standard issue. Patients recovering from surgery were given weak ale instead of water, partly to avoid infection, partly to keep them docile. Nurses measured recovery not in heart rate, but in how quickly a patient could finish his tankard. "He's well enough to drink again" was the Georgian equivalent of a clean bill of health. Beer soothed the fevered, fed the starving, and kept the wards smelling faintly better than they might have otherwise. Even intellectuals joined the chorus of praise. The philosopher John Locke called beer a wholesome provision for man, while Daniel Defoe claimed it preserves the labourer's strength and the scholar's wits. This was perhaps optimistic. Many scholars wrote their most confusing essays after 3 pints, but the sentiment stood. Beer was both moral and medicinal, a patriotic antidote to French wine and continental sophistication. To drink it was to affirm one's Britishness and one's immune system simultaneously. Of course, there were dissenters, a few nervous voices warning that perhaps this national self-medication had its drawbacks. Some doctors noticed that patients who recovered with ale tended to relapse frequently, usually by lunchtime. But their warnings were drowned out by the clinking of mugs and the insistence that a cheerful heart cannot ail. Georgian medicine prized vitality above all else, and beer delivered vitality in abundance, at least until you tried to walk in a straight line. By the end of the century, as medical science began to creep toward actual evidence, beer's reputation as a cure-all started to wobble. New discoveries about the body, blood circulation, germs, nutrition, hinted that maybe not everything could be solved by barley. But for most Georgians, beer remained the closest thing to a universal remedy. If it didn't heal you, it at least made you stop caring. And so the era's greatest prescription endured: got a headache? Have a pint. Got too many pints? Have another. Somewhere between medicine and merriment, beer had become the national therapy, one that worked just well enough to keep Britain alive and tipsy for another generation. In the age before billboards, jingles and glossy ads, Georgian Britain discovered something both terrifying and brilliant, that people could be persuaded not just to drink, but to choose. The pint, once a local affair, became a brand, and the brewer, once a tradesman, became a personality. This was the birth of advertising, Georgian style, when word of mouth met word of mug, and the nation's love of beer evolved into something far more modern. Loyalty, or as we'd call it today, marketing. It began innocently enough. In a world where nearly every town had its own brewery, competition was fierce. Brewers needed ways to distinguish their product from the next man's. And since all beer essentially looked like a liquid loaf, they sold everything around it: reputation, reliability, and rumour. Early advertising wasn't about persuasion, it was about gossip. A whispered, "Have you tried Mr. Whitbread's porter?" did more than 100 posters ever could. The first real beer ads weren't printed at all, they were painted. Pub signs became the visual language of the drinker's world, hanging above taverns like promises of pleasure. Because most Georgians couldn't read, these signs had to speak through imagery. A proud lion, a frothy tankard, a jolly friar hoisting a barrel. Some were elaborate works of art. Others looked as though painted by someone already halfway through the product, but they worked. You didn't need to read to recognise your favourite haunt. You just needed to spot the red cow or drunken parrot. As industrial brewing expanded, big names began to dominate, and they knew it. Whitbread, Barclay Perkins, Truman and Bass realised that beer wasn't just a drink. It was a statement. A pint of Whitbread porter said you were a man of taste. A barrel of Bass meant quality worth shipping to India. It was the dawn of consumer identity. You weren't just drinking ale, you were declaring allegiance. These early brewers mastered something their medieval predecessors never imagined: brand consistency. Georgian consumers might tolerate adulterated gin or stale bread, but not bad beer from a trusted name. Brewers plastered their names on barrels, pub walls, and even the metal taps themselves, the 18th century version of a logo. The base red triangle, one of the earliest registered trademarks, was a symbol recognised across continents. People trusted it the way modern consumers trust a logo on a latte cup. But brand loyalty doesn't sustain itself, it needs flair. Enter the age of endorsements. Before influencers, there were dukes pretending to love your lager. Wealthy patrons and titled drinkers lent their names and their palates to certain brewers. "Patronised by His Grace the Duke of Norfolk," read one advertisement, conveniently omitting that His Grace also patronised several other breweries, often simultaneously. Still, it worked. Nothing sold beer like the suggestion that nobility drank it too, even if they probably preferred claret in private. Print advertising followed soon after, thanks to the explosion of newspapers and pamphlets. Georgian readers, flipping through columns of politics and poetry, found small, bold notices promising the finest porter in all London, or a drink fit for the stoutest sailor. The copy was simple, repetitive, and oddly confident, like a drunk man explaining why his beer was the best, but it planted seeds. By the late 18th century, pubs were no longer just pubs. They were branded outlets, extensions of a brewer's empire. Advertising also changed how people talked about beer. Brewers invented slogans before the word slogan existed. They promised purity, brewed from the choicest malt, strength to sustain a labourer through his toil, and patriotism, English beer for English men. Even science got dragged into the pitch. One famous ad claimed its ale was fermented by the newest mechanical process, precise and clean. Translation: we finally stopped guessing. Some brewers even dabbled in what we would now call product placement. Plays and songs began to feature specific brands, usually with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Tavern scenes might include lines like, "Fetch us a jug of Truman's finest," followed by exaggerated sighs of satisfaction. Meanwhile, poets penned odes to their favourite brews, with titles such as "Ode to a Porter That Saved Me from Sorrow." The boundary between marketing and art was as blurry as the customer's vision after a few pints. Brand wars were inevitable. Rival brewers accused each other of watering down beer or using inferior hops. Some even hired pamphleteers to spread scandalous rumours, early PR sabotage. The papers printed letters to the editor, debating the merits of rival porters, often written by the brewers themselves under pseudonyms like "A Concerned Drinker." It was the 18th century version of online reviews, biased, entertaining and fueled by ego. The most brilliant innovation, though, was emotional marketing. Brewers realised that beer wasn't just about taste, it was about belonging. A trusted pint connected people to their city, their trade, their tavern. Drinking the same beer as your neighbours meant you shared in something communal, even patriotic. Beer became less about the liquid in the mug and more about the feeling it represented: comfort, reliability, identity. Georgian advertising didn't invent marketing psychology, but it certainly drank to it. By the end of the century, brewers were as famous as politicians, and often more beloved. Samuel Whitbread, who built one of London's largest breweries, became a public figure, his name synonymous with success and quality. When he entered Parliament, some joked he represented the constituency of the entire thirsty nation. Beer, once humble and anonymous, now had celebrity status, and its makers basked in the frothy spotlight. The birth of beer advertising marked a turning point in British life. The pint, that simple companion of labourers and lords alike, had become more than sustenance. It was an experience to be sold. From painted pub signs to noble endorsements, from jingles on the page to whispers in the street, Georgian Britain learned to market happiness in a mug. And the secret to their success? They didn't sell beer. They sold belonging, with a side of bubbles. Every age gets the art it deserves, and Georgian Britain, steeped in hops and hypocrisy, got a gallery full of drunks pretending to be moral lessons. Satirists, poets and painters wagged their fingers at the nation's drinking habits, while clearly having the time of their lives doing so. Their message was simple: drinking too much is terrible, accompanied by a vivid, hilarious depiction of exactly how fun it looked. The moral? Don't drink too much, but first, enjoy this illustration of everyone doing exactly that. No artist captured this boozy paradox better than William Hogarth, Britain's great chronicler of vice and virtue, who spent the mid-18th century turning London's sins into art that was equal parts sermon and slapstick. His most famous pair of engravings, Beer Street and Gin Lane, 1751, were meant to contrast wholesome British beer with the horrors of gin addiction. On Beer Street, defaced craftsmen and cheerful maids raise mugs of foaming ale beneath a bright sun, industrious and content. Over in Gin Lane chaos reigns. Skeletal mothers, collapsing houses, and a man sawing off his own leg for fun. The point was obvious: beer good, gin bad. But the truth? People loved both prints, especially the gin one. Nothing says anti-alcohol campaign like a poster you want to hang in your tavern. Hogarth's work wasn't alone. From the stage to the page, the Georgian art scene was drenched in ale. Playwrights wrote comedies full of bibulous characters whose entire purpose was to drink, moralise about drinking, and then drink again. The theatre thrived on contradiction, warning audiences about excess while delivering 2 hours of it live on stage. Characters like Sir Toby Belch or Old Hard Ale filled playbills, each more gleefully intoxicated than the last. When the curtain fell, the audience stumbled out to the nearest tavern to discuss how terrible drinking was, over a few pints naturally. Literature, too, found its muse in the mug. Poets like Charles Dibdin, Oliver Goldsmith, and countless anonymous balladeers celebrated ale as both comfort and curse. Poems with titles such as The Praise of Beer or Ode to My Morning Pint read like moral lectures delivered by someone clearly tipsy while writing them. They scolded excess while lovingly describing the golden glow of a full mug, the satisfying weight of the pewter tankard, and the camaraderie of shared inebriation. Georgian readers didn't take these as warnings, they took them as invitations. Even religion got in on the act. Sermons condemning drunkenness were common, but so were hymns that described the cup that cheers yet not inebriates. The clergy tried to thread the needle between moral duty and social reality. One priest in Bath thundered against the abominations of public houses, then was spotted hours later enjoying a restorative ale at the same establishment. Hypocrisy wasn't a flaw in Georgian morality, it was practically a tradition. Visual satire exploded alongside print culture. Caricatures and engravings sold on London streets depicted drunken gatherings, beer-fueled brawls, and tipsy judges asleep in court. Artists like Thomas Rowlandson and James Gilray turned public intoxication into popular entertainment. Their prints often came with ironic captions like "Temperance Rewarded," showing a man collapsed under a table, or "The Honest Brewer's Prosperity," featuring an alehouse bursting with delighted drunks. These weren't moral lessons, they were early comic strips. But satire had teeth too. As Britain's cities grew, so did concern over the moral decline of the urban drunkard. Artists portrayed drink as both symptom and symbol, the bubbling ale that mirrored social chaos. Beer Street might have been cheerful, but later, works grew more biting. The moralists wanted to prove that indulgence led to ruin. The satirists, however, suspected that ruin looked rather fun. This tension gave above Georgian art its energy, half sermon, half celebration, all slightly drunk. Even architecture got theatrical about morality. Many pubs adopted grand names like "The Honest Tradesman" or "The Virtue's Reward," as if by giving a tavern a righteous title, you could neutralise its purpose. Inside, the decor often included moral paintings or biblical quotes, all conveniently placed above the bar. A man could read "Woe unto him who tarrieth long at the wine," while ordering his fifth ale and feel spiritually balanced. Magazines and pamphlets amplified the hypocrisy with gusto. The Gentleman's Magazine, a mainstay of Georgian publishing, regularly featured essays condemning the nation's drunkenness, while placing advertisements for porter, ale and wine on the facing page. It was the 18th century equivalent of running a health article beside a cigarette ad, and nobody seemed to mind. The economy of virtue depended on vice. Some writers, however, used satire to question not the drinkers, but the society that drove them to drink. Moralising plays often ended with characters repenting, but the real target was poverty, inequality, or the crushing monotony of industrial life. Beer wasn't the disease, it was the symptom. The playwrights knew it, even if they had to pretend otherwise. After all, the audience wanted comedy, not sociology. Still, beneath the laughter, a quiet critique fermented. Maybe a country that needed so much beer had other problems to fix. And yet, for all their finger-wagging, Georgian artists couldn't help themselves. They loved their subject too much. Drunkenness was vivid, funny, and profoundly human. It offered movement, colour, and chaos, all things the public adored. If virtue was quiet, vice was good theatre. And if vice could be laughed at, perhaps it wasn't so terrible after all. So Britain's artists scolded with one hand and toasted with the other, turning moral outrage into profitable entertainment. Their message was a masterpiece of contradiction. Drink responsibly, dear viewer, but do drink, so we'll have something to write about. If London was the brain of Georgian Britain's beer empire, then Burton-upon-Trent was its beating, bubbling heart, a town where the streets ran with ambition and the air smelled faintly of yeast and achievement. By the late 18th century, Burton had transformed from a sleepy market settlement into an industrial wonderland of malt, steam and river water, so perfect that it might as well have been blessed by Bacchus himself. To the rest of Britain, Burton was proof that prosperity could, in fact, be brewed. Burton's secret ingredient wasn't just hard work, it was chemistry. Its water, rich in calcium sulfate, was naturally suited for producing pale, crisp beers that stayed clear and travelled well. Other brewers called it liquid gold, though not everyone meant it kindly. Rival towns accused Burton brewers of witch water, as if success could only come from sorcery. But science, or what passed for science in the Georgian era, was on Burton's side. When the town's pale ales began outselling London's heavy porters, the capital's brewers tried to copy the flavour. They failed. You could imitate the process, but not the river. The Trent itself became a conveyor belt of fortune. Barges laden with barrels drifted downstream, their cargoes destined for London, Liverpool and beyond. The riverbanks buzzed with coopers hammering staves, maltsters drying grain, and clerks tallying profits in ledgers thick with beer stains. Burton's rhythm was the sound of wooden casks rolling and coins clinking, the symphony of an industry in full fermentation. By the turn of the century, Burton had earned its nickname, the Brewery of Britain. Dozens of independent breweries clustered together, forming what one visitor described as a town that smells perpetually of breakfast. Indeed, the sweet, toasty scent of malt hung in the air day and night, a perfume that either inspired affection or nausea, depending on how long you stayed. Locals claimed that Burton's air fortified the lungs. Outsiders joked that you could get tipsy just by breathing. Truth probably lay somewhere in between. Burton's air smelled like success and yeast. The growth wasn't limited to Burton. Across the country, industrial brewing towns flourished. Manchester, Leeds and Edinburgh each had their own brewing districts, busy, noisy landscapes of steam power and innovation. But Burton stood out not only for its water, but for its ambition. Its brewers didn't just serve the domestic market, they eyed the empire. India, with its sweating British officials and parched soldiers, presented an irresistible opportunity. The problem was spoilage. Most beer soured before it could survive the months-long voyage. Burton's Pale Ale, however, held firm. Enter the legendary India Pale Ale, or IPA, a beer strong enough and bitter enough to endure the journey from the Trent to the tropics. It was a marvel of chemistry and marketing, a drink that tasted better the farther it travelled. Soldiers in Calcutta toasted Burton's brewers as heroes, while merchants back home counted profits that smelled faintly of hops and victory. Burton had become a global brand before the word brand even existed. The town's wealth reshaped its skyline. Brick chimneys rose like steeples to the god of fermentation. Breweries sprawled across the landscape, connected by canals and warehouses. Streets were lined with pubs, owned by the very companies whose beer they served. Vertical integration at its most intoxicating. Every family had a connection to the trade. Coopers made barrels, blacksmiths forged hoops, and even children were employed to clean bottles or roll casks. The entire town pulsed to the rhythm of production and profit. Innovation thrived alongside expansion. Burton brewers embraced every new invention: steam engines to grind malt, thermometers to control mash temperatures, hydrometers to measure sugar content. The days of brewing by smell were over. Precision had replaced prayer. Yet for all the technology, the business retained its human heart, a culture of craftsmanship and pride that treated each barrel as an ambassador of the town's name. A spoiled batch wasn't just a financial loss, it was a stain on Burton's honour. Visitors were dazzled. Travellers described seeing oceans of beer glinting under gaslight, breweries that felt like cathedrals, and workers who seemed perpetually cheerful, though it was unclear whether from wages or samples. Industrialists toured the facilities like art galleries, marvelling at the efficiency of it all. Beer had become an industry, but also a spectacle. To see Burton in its prime was to witness the fusion of science, commerce, and intoxication, Britain's industrial spirit distilled in malt. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Moral reformers sniffed disapproval, calling the brewing boom a monument to temptation. Economists warned of overproduction, and rival towns sulked. London's once dominant breweries accused Burton of stealing their trade and its drinkers. In response, Burton simply built bigger barrels. Its success was unassailable, until railways made it unstoppable. When the railway arrived in the 1830s, Burton's reach exploded. What once took days by barge now took hours by train. The town's beer flowed to every corner of Britain and across the empire. Bottled Burton ales appeared in far-flung colonies, Bombay, Cape Town, Singapore, bearing the town's name as proudly as any royal seal. The phrase Burton Brew became shorthand for quality, a stamp of excellence recognised from taverns to drawing rooms. But perhaps Burton's greatest achievement was intangible. It gave industrial Britain something to be proud of, proof that mass production didn't have to mean mediocrity. The same machinery that churned out textiles and iron could also produce beauty, taste and joy in liquid form. Burton showed that progress could be profitable and pleasurable, that industry could still have soul, even if it smelled faintly of fermentation. By the end of the Georgian and early Victorian era, Burton was no longer just a town. It was a legend, the place where water turned to wealth, where chemistry met culture, and where beer became more than a drink. It became destiny. There was a time when Britain greeted the sunrise with a tankard. A frothy pint was the alarm clock, breakfast and mood stabiliser all in one. But by the end of the Georgian era, something remarkable happened. Britain sobered up before noon. The morning pint, once as sacred as prayer and as routine as breathing, began its slow decline, replaced by the new jittery gods of caffeine, tea and coffee. Suddenly, Britain woke up, literally and figuratively. The shift wasn't overnight. It began as a quiet rebellion among the polite classes, those who had grown weary of starting their day slightly cross-eyed. Respectability was on the rise, so was the price of beer. Meanwhile, tea and coffee, once rare luxuries imported from the East and the colonies, were becoming more accessible. What had started as aristocratic indulgence trickled down into middle-class virtue. To drink tea at breakfast was refined. To drink beer was old-fashioned. Moral reformers and physicians helped seal the pint's fate. After years of preaching moderation, they finally found allies who could offer an alternative beverage that didn't involve mild intoxication. Doctors began writing glowingly about the stimulating yet civilizing effects of tea. Coffee, they claimed, awakened the intellect without inflaming the passions, a phrase that sounds clinical until you realise it's code for you can still make it to work. Beer, on the other hand, was accused of clouding the faculties and lowering productivity. In other words, it was bad for business, and Georgian Britain, now knee-deep in the Industrial Revolution, was all about business. The rhythms of work changed everything. Machines didn't care for hangovers. The new factory bells demanded punctuality and precision, qualities not always compatible with ale at dawn. Employers began discouraging morning drinking not out of morality but necessity. A worker on beer time moved slower, thought slower, and occasionally tried to fix gears that didn't need fixing. Caffeine, on the other hand, sharpened edges. A cup of tea could make a clerk efficient. A pint of beer made him poetic, and no one wanted poetry in the textile mill. As the middle class expanded, so did its obsession with self-control. Sobriety became a social marker, a way of distinguishing oneself from the rougher classes still clinging to their morning pints. Tea tables replaced ale benches, porcelain cups replaced pewter mugs. To sip was genteel. To gulp was gauche. The morning meal, once hearty and boozy, transformed into a delicate ritual involving china, conversation, and just enough caffeine to make gossip sound profound. The language around drinking shifted too. Beer at breakfast had once been called wholesome and strengthening. Now it was vulgar. Coffee was enlightened. Tea was moral. By the early 19th century, even public houses began advertising breakfast teas for respectable patrons. Alehouses quietly dropped their dawn opening hours, and taverns reinvented themselves as tea rooms, though judging by attendance, many patrons mourned the change deeply. For centuries, beer had been the common denominator of British life, the one drink shared across all classes. Its retreat from the breakfast table marked a cultural divide. In rural villages, the tradition lingered longer. Farmers and labourers still began their day with ale, partly out of habit and partly out of hydration. But even there, the tide was turning. By mid-century, cheap tea had infiltrated the countryside, sold by travelling merchants and peddled as the drink of progress. Housewives brewed it proudly, declaring it cleaner than beer, and far less likely to end with someone singing to the livestock. Urban life sealed the pint's doom. The new commuter culture, with its early trains and tighter schedules, left little time for a leisurely mug of ale. No one wanted to show up at the office reeking of malt. Coffee houses and tea rooms fit the new tempo perfectly, and quick, social and stimulating without scandal. A man could drink 6 cups of coffee before lunch and still keep his job. 6 pints of beer, and he was lunch. The decline of the morning pint also mirrored Britain's shifting global identity. The empire ran on imports, tea from India, coffee from Ceylon, sugar from the Caribbean, and drinking these products became an act of patriotism wrapped in porcelain. Every sip reinforced Britain's place in the world economy. Beer might have built the empire, but tea symbolised its refinement. The pint was practical, the teacup imperial, even fashion joined the crusade. Engravings and advertisements from the period began to feature elegant ladies in lace pouring tea, while beer was increasingly associated with ruddy-faced tradesmen and comic servants. To drink tea was to signal discipline, intelligence, and taste, all the new virtues of industrial civilization. To drink beer in the morning was to announce that you had missed the memo. By the Victorian era, the transformation was complete. The morning pint had become a relic, a quaint reminder of a less self-conscious age. Beer was now for evenings, celebrations, and weekends, no longer a sunrise companion but a twilight indulgence. The national narrative had changed from beer keeps us alive to tea keeps us proper. And as Britain embraced punctuality, propriety, and progress, caffeine replaced alcohol as the approved national stimulant. It's easy to mock the shift now, to imagine millions of slightly dazed Britons squinting at their first teacup and wondering, oh, where's the foam? But in its own way, it marked a profound moment in history. The dawn of modern consciousness, the sobering of a nation that finally decided to be awake while conquering the world. The pint had sustained the body, but tea and its jittery cousin, coffee, sustained the mind. So, Britain traded buzz for balance, foam for focus. The tavern gave way to the tea room, and though the beer barrels still rolled through the streets of Burton, the sound that now echoed through the morning air was gentler. The clink of porcelain, the hiss of the kettle, and the rustle of newspapers announcing that the country was, at long last, sober enough to read them. Even after Britain swapped its morning mug of ale for a cup of tea, the effects of its centuries-long love affair with beer lingered everywhere. In its streets, its homes, its health, even its architecture. Beer had left a hangover not just in the heads of the nation's drinkers, but in the very bones of British society. You can sober up a country, but you can't sober up its plumbing, its laws, or its culture overnight. When everyone drinks for breakfast, even your plumbing has to adapt. Start with infrastructure. The Georgian and early Victorian boom in brewing had shaped towns and cities physically. Breweries were often the first industrial complexes to appear, bringing with them rail lines, canals, and entire neighbourhoods built to house their workers. Burton-upon-Trent, London, Suffolk, and Edinburgh's Fountain Bridge all grew around their breweries like yeast in a barrel. Streets were named after hops, malt, and barrels. Pubs became civic landmarks. The very layout of many towns still bears the outline of their drinking past. Industrial arteries built to move beer faster than thought. Beer even dictated urban hygiene. The brewing process demanded clean water long before cities cared about sanitation. Breweries often became the only reliable sources of boiled, purified liquid in town. Some municipalities quietly relied on them to keep epidemics at bay. In London, before Joseph Bazalgette dreamed of sewers, the brewer's boiling kettle was the city's accidental health system. Water unboiled and unsafe spread disease. Beer, boiled and fermented, saved lives, albeit while slightly impairing judgment. The irony was delicious. A population that couldn't drink water built a civilization on beer and accidentally discovered public health. But beer didn't just shape where people lived, it shaped how they lived. Working-class housing in industrial towns was often built within walking or wobbling distance of a pub. Developers considered proximity to beer as essential as proximity to a church. Many new neighbourhoods came pre-equipped with a corner alehouse, the 18th century version of a community centre. Families might live in one-room cottages, but they had a pub to expand into, a second living room where warmth, news, and social order were dispensed by the pint. The pub, refined over centuries of British drinking, became a cornerstone of identity. Its design evolved alongside the drinkers' habits. Georgian taverns were open, communal, and noisy, places for debate and debauchery. But by the 19th century, with temperance reformers breathing down everyone's necks, pubs adapted. Screens went up, separating snugs for women and private drinkers. Windows frosted over to protect reputations. The bar itself became a marvel of design, curved to fit more patrons, raised to discourage leaning, and stocked like a ship's galley to serve a sea of thirst. Beer had spawned an entire architectural genre of the pub interior, built to balance sociability and secrecy. Meanwhile, the nation's health was still recovering from its long liquid diet. Generations of beer as breakfast had left Britain with a paradoxical metabolism, resistant to famine but reliant on alcohol for calories. When reformers finally introduced clean water and affordable tea, doctors noted a wave of what they delicately called digestive confusion. The British gut, trained on molten yeast, didn't know what to do with sobriety. Some even speculated that the post-beer generation was shorter and less cheerful. Science disagreed, but sentiment lingered. Life seemed duller without a morning pint. Yet beer's long rule had left behind unexpected benefits. The need for consistent brewing had quietly driven advances in chemistry, engineering, and logistics. The hydrometer, invented for measuring sugar content in wort, later influenced scientific instrumentation. Techniques for sterilizing barrels prefigured food safety practices. Even the humble pub tap was a marvel of mechanical precision, a small monument to British problem-solving under the influence. In a strange twist, the same beverage that blurred millions of minds sharpened a few enough to invent the modern factory. Culturally, the hangover of beer shaped how Britain saw itself. Drunkenness, once universal, became class-coded. The poor were mocked for it. The rich romanticised it. Artists, poets, and politicians kept the nation's boozy past alive in memory, turning it into nostalgia. The merry England of folklore, with its jolly farmers and singing taverns, was less a historical reality and more a tipsy daydream from centuries of drinking. Even as Britain modernised, the image of the happy drunk remained comforting, proof that pleasure and progress could still share a table. Beer also changed the law. Licensing acts, born to regulate the chaos of Georgian taverns, evolved into a permanent feature of British governance. Opening hours, serving restrictions, alcohol taxes, all remnants of a nation trying to manage its own thirst. The fact that the word publican survived as a respectable profession is testament to how central drinking remained to public life. A brewer might be a businessman, but a publican was a public servant, a keeper of order, confidant, and sometimes therapist, paid in pints. The physical legacy of beer extended underground too, quite literally. Many old cities still sit atop labyrinths of former beer cellars and storage tunnels, vast cool chambers that once held barrels by the thousands. Some have become tourist attractions, others secret basements for modern pubs. In a way, Britain still lives on top of its own brewing past, its cities resting on a foundation of fermentation. Even the pipes beneath the streets carry beer's legacy. Brewing demanded reliable water flow, and early breweries often dug their own rudimentary plumbing systems to service both production and surrounding homes. When municipal systems finally arrived, they were built to those same roots. Britain's water infrastructure in part followed the logic of beer. Every city plumbed for thirst long before sanitation caught up. And so, the hangover of history lingers not in empty mugs, but in the everyday. In the pub on every corner, in the amber glow of stained glass signs, in the easy camaraderie of strangers who still begin their friendships with "fancy a pint." The morning mug may have vanished, but the nation's identity remained fermented, warm, frothy, and self-aware enough to laugh at itself. Beer shaped Britain's health, homes, and habits, and even when the pint retreated from breakfast, it refused to leave the table. Because you can take the beer out of the morning, but you can't take the morning out of the beer. Centuries after Britain sobered up at sunrise, the echo of clinking tankards still lingers in the national bloodstream. Beer may have lost its place at the breakfast table, but it never left the British soul. It evolved, from necessity to nostalgia, from daily fuel to cultural icon. The country that once ran on mild ale now runs on coffee, spreadsheets, and polite exhaustion, but beer remains the drink that built its foundations, The good news? You no longer need beer to survive. The bad news? You still need coffee to function. The pint glass is Britain's most enduring monument, more recognisable than Big Ben, more comforting than the monarchy. It's not just a container, it's a time capsule. Each pour carries centuries of trial, toil and toast. Every pub, from the creaky oak taverns of Devon to the chrome-lit bars of London, is an heir to that Georgian heritage of laughter, arguments, and slightly questionable hygiene. The pub is the modern church of conversation, less judgmental, more affordable, and far more fun. Walk into any British pub today and you're stepping into history with better plumbing. The dark wood, the brass taps, the low murmur of voices, all remnants of a culture that refused to let go of its favourite ritual. Even the layout tells a story. The bar counter, born in the Georgian era, still divides the public from the private, while the snug offers sanctuary to those who want their pint with a side of secrecy. The beer itself has changed, lighter, colder and occasionally pretentious, but the spirit behind it hasn't. It's still about pause, about presence, about belonging, in a country where small talk is an Olympic sport. Britain's brewing tradition also survived its own industrial ghosts. The 20th century nearly drowned it in uniformity, mass production, tin cans and beers so bland they could have been beige in flavour. But just when it seemed the pint might go quietly into the fluorescent night, something remarkable happened. The craft revival. Small brewers, descendants in spirit of the old Georgian brewsters, rose again, tinkering, experimenting and defying the monopolies of mass lager. In a poetic twist, the future of beer began to look suspiciously like its past. Local, distinctive, proudly independent. The circle had closed, one satisfying sip at a time. Yet beer today isn't just tradition, it's memory disguised as refreshment. Each pint holds a faint echo of the fields of barley that once stretched across England, of the dock workers who drank for strength, of the philosophers who argued over foamy mugs in coffeehouses and called it progress. To drink beer in modern Britain is to join a conversation that's been going on for 1,000 years, one where nobody really wins, but everyone leaves feeling slightly better about the world. Even those who don't drink it still live in its shadow. The pub quiz, the Friday pint, the phrase, "let's grab a drink," all are descendants of the beer-soaked Georgian habit of blending work, wit, and mild inebriation. The British social engine still runs on shared beverages. Tea brings politeness. Beer brings honesty. The former opens a conversation, the latter finishes it. Together they form the national emotional spectrum. Culturally, beer remains the great equalizer. Class divides that once determined who drank what have blurred into irrelevance. The same pint can belong to a banker or a builder, a poet or a plumber. The Georgian hierarchy of fine ale for the rich, swill for the poor has flattened into a single democratic act, standing at the bar, elbow to elbow, waiting for your turn. For all its economic revolutions, Britain never found a better symbol of equality than two strangers sharing the same beer and pretending it's not awkward. And then there's the nostalgia, that golden-hued memory of the good old days, when men wore waistcoats, women wore lace, and everyone was just the right amount of tipsy by noon. Modern Britain romanticises its drinking past the way it romanticises everything else, fondly, inaccurately, and with a deep awareness that the reality probably smelled worse. But there's something endearing in that memory. The idea that beer once carried the nation through plagues, wars, and industrial upheaval makes every pint today taste a little braver. Even the health debate has mellowed. Gone are the days when doctors prescribed beer as medicine, though if you listen closely you'll still hear echoes of that logic. Just one pint is good for you, say optimists everywhere, quoting imaginary science while ignoring the other four they're holding. The truth is simpler. Beer might not cure you, but it connects you. To people, to peace, to the long, unbroken story of survival through shared pleasure. The world around beer has modernised, but its rhythm remains ancient. Breweries may hum with steel and sensors instead of fire and guesswork, but the alchemy is the same. Grain, water, yeast and time. A quartet that built cities, funded empires and filled poets' notebooks with questionable rhymes. Even the technology that once threatened to sterilize the soul out of brewing has found harmony with it. Today's precision equipment simply ensures that every pint of tradition arrives perfectly poured. Yet the final legacy of Britain's beer age isn't just physical or economic, it's emotional. The British relationship with beer taught the nation how to cope, with weather, with work, with history itself. It turned endurance into celebration and dullness into ritual. The pint was never about intoxication alone. It was about resilience disguised as relaxation. Every age since has inherited that skill to take life's heaviness and make it go down smoother. And so, while Britain no longer greets the dawn with ale, it still ends its days with it. The pint remains the punctuation mark on the British sentence, a pause between effort and rest, between chaos and calm. It's the drink that built the country, then stood quietly by while tea took the morning shift. The good news: you no longer need beer to survive. The bad news: you still need coffee to function. But somewhere deep in the British soul, beneath the caffeine, the decorum and the deadlines, the old instinct still stirs at sunset. A whisper from history, bubbling up like foam on a fresh pour, reminding the nation that civilization, at least in Britain, has always been happier slightly fermented.